My name is Charlene Young, and I am 34 years old. The morning my parents handed my brother the deed to the business I had run for 15 years, they did not even have the grace to pull me into the back office. They did it right at the front register. The store smelled like it always did on a Tuesday, a rich blend of roasted espresso, fresh cedar, and the sharp, clean scent of the Rhode Island sea breeze blowing in off the harbor. I was wiping down the mahogany counter when the bell above the door chimed. My father, my mother, and my younger brother Colin walked in together. They moved in a tight formation, stepping past the displays of local artisan goods I had spent a decade curating. My father placed a heavy blue folder on the counter. Beside it, he dropped the master ring of brass keys. The metal hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud. My mother adjusted her designer scarf and offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Charlene," she said, her voice dripping with practiced diplomacy. "We have made a family decision. Colin just finished his business program, and we are transferring ownership of the store to him. He is going to modernize the brand." Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his modern vision in less than a week, I want to pause. Welcome to Intimately Told Stories. Tell me how old you are, where you are watching from, and what the weather is like today. I want to see how far this story of family betrayal and ultimate payback travels. I stood behind the counter and looked at the three of them. 15 years. I started working here when the roof leaked and the accounts were deep in the red. I spent my 20s skipping vacations, unloading delivery trucks at 4 in the morning, and learning the names of every local supplier, fisherman, and farm cooperative in the state. I built this place from a failing convenience shop into the premier provisioning hub for Newport estates and chartered yachts. Colin spent those same 15 years failing out of 2 different colleges and crashing cars our parents paid to fix. Colin leaned against the register. He wore a crisp new suit that looked stiff off the rack. "Do not worry, Char," he said, his lips curling into a smug, unearned smirk. "I am still going to keep you on as inventory manager. You know where all the boxes go." He thought I would cry. My mother braced herself for a screaming match. My father looked at his watch, eager to bypass the emotion and get to the celebratory brunch they had undoubtedly booked. They all expected me to beg for the scraps of the empire I built with my own hands. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my chest. I did not raise my voice. I reached behind my neck, untied the heavy canvas apron, and folded it into a neat square. I placed it over the blue folder. Then I picked up my personal cell phone from the shelf. "I am resigning," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and devoid of the panic they anticipated. My father scoffed. "Do not be dramatic, Charlene. You need this job." I looked him dead in the eye. "I do not need the building, Dad." I walked out from behind the counter, pushed past my brother without letting my shoulder brush his, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I left them standing in a store packed with premium inventory, oblivious to the reality that the business was not the shelves, the register, or the brass keys. The business was the phone in my pocket, and by the end of the week, Colin would learn that you cannot inherit loyalty. The salt air hitting my face felt different the moment the heavy glass door swung shut behind me. For a decade and a half, I had only ever breathed the Newport Harbor breeze while rushing to unlock the loading dock or dragging display boards onto the sidewalk. Now I walked down the cobblestone street with my hands empty. I listened to the sharp cries of the gulls and the rhythmic clanging of the halyards against the aluminum masts in the marina. My chest felt suspiciously light. I did not rush to my car. I took a slow, deliberate stroll along the seawall, watching the morning fog burn off the water. To understand the sheer magnitude of the mistake my family had just made, you have to understand the ecosystem of Rhode Island coastal commerce. The store was not a franchise. It was an independent provisioning hub. When my parents handed me the keys at 19, it was a failing maritime supply shop selling stale coffee, stale bread, and cheap fishing tackle. They wanted to shut it down. I spent the next 15 years pivoting the entire business model. I targeted the luxury yacht market, the private estate managers, and the elite summer residents who demanded bespoke quality. I built a network that operated entirely on trust handshakes and my personal guarantee. The local organic farmers, the artisanal cheese makers in the rolling hills of the mainland, the deep-sea fishermen pulling their boats into Point Judith, they did not do business with a corporate entity. They did not care about the name painted on the wooden sign above the door. They did business with me. They knew I paid my invoices on time, I respected their labor, and I never haggled over the price of a perfect catch. My parents thought the value of the business lived in the prime real estate and the polished mahogany shelves. They viewed the suppliers as nameless cogs in a machine that would automatically keep turning for whoever stood behind the register. The first domino fell at 4 in the morning the following day. My internal clock woke me up in the dark long before the sun even considered rising. Normally, I would be pulling on waterproof boots and a heavy fleece jacket, heading down to the docks to inspect the morning catch. Instead, I stayed under my warm duvet and watched the snow fall outside my window. At exactly 4:15, my cell phone vibrated against the nightstand. The caller ID showed a picture of a weathered boat deck. It was Elias, a second-generation commercial fisherman who supplied the store with premium line-caught halibut and dayboat scallops. These were the exact items the private yacht chefs paid a premium for. The items that drove 40% of our weekly profit margin. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Morning, Elias," I said, keeping my voice smooth and rested. Charlene Elias rumbled his voice thick with a heavy coastal accent and obvious irritation. "I am standing at the back loading dock. The lights are off. The door is locked. There's some kid sitting in a running BMW out front. He just rolled his window down and told me to leave the coolers on the wet pavement because he does not want to ruin his Italian leather shoes stepping in the puddles." A quiet, genuine smile spread across my face in the dark bedroom. Colin had assumed running the store meant counting the cash drawer at noon and shaking hands with wealthy tourists. He had no concept of the freezing, unglamorous labor that preceded the polished retail experience. "That would be my younger brother, Colin," I explained. "My parents transferred ownership to him yesterday morning. I am no longer employed there." The line went dead silent, save for the sound of the diesel engine idling in the background. Elias was a man of very few words, but he understood the fragile mechanics of respect. "You are gone?" Elias finally asked. "I resigned," I clarified. Another beat of silence, then a sharp exhale of breath. This kid just asked me if I would accept a net 90 payment term on fresh seafood. He handed me a printed corporate contract. He wants me to float his inventory for 3 months. I do not do contracts with strangers, Char. And I certainly do not leave premium scallops on the wet asphalt for a boy afraid of a little harbor water. "You run your business how you see fit, Elias," I replied. "I would never tell you to compromise your standards." "I am loading the coolers back onto the truck," Elias said, the irritation in his tone hardening into resolve. "I have a buyer at the restaurants downtown who will take the whole lot for cash. If you set up shop somewhere else, you call me. Otherwise, this store is cut off." He hung up. I set the phone back on the nightstand and closed my eyes. By 7 in the morning, the situation escalated. My phone buzzed 3 more times. The artisanal baker who delivered our signature sourdough loaves texted to say Colin had demanded a 30% bulk discount, claiming the new management was trimming the fat. The baker turned his delivery van around and went back to his kitchen. The organic farm cooperative sent an email stating they were pausing our account because the new owner had insulted their driver and demanded they unbox the produce themselves. Colin was applying outdated corporate boardroom tactics to blue-collar artisans who prided themselves on independence. He was trying to assert dominance over people who held the actual power. At 9:15, the store was supposed to open its doors to the morning rush of estate managers and yacht chefs. At 9:20, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed my mother. I let it ring 3 times, letting the tension stretch before answering. "Hello, Mother." "Charlene, where are you?" Her voice was shrill, laced with an unnatural pitch that gave away her underlying panic. "Colin is trying to open the store, but half the deliveries never showed up. The fresh cases are empty. The chefs are coming in for their morning provisions, and he has nothing to sell them." I poured myself a cup of hot tea in my kitchen. "That sounds like an inventory management issue. As Colin mentioned yesterday, he is modernizing the brand. I am sure he has a strategy." "Do not use that tone with me," she snapped. The mask of diplomacy she had worn the day before was entirely gone. "You need to come down here right now. Colin says the suppliers are being unreasonable. He needs the master vendor list, the account passwords, and the personal contact numbers for the farm directors. You left the physical ledger in the safe, but it is outdated. He needs your digital files." I walked over to the window and looked out at the frost covering the tree branches. "I never signed a non-disclosure agreement," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "I never signed a non-compete clause. I was a salaried employee. The physical ledger in the safe belongs to the store. The digital contacts in my personal cell phone, the relationships I cultivated over 15 years belong to me." "You are being petty," my mother hissed. "This is family property. You owe your brother a smooth transition. Get in your car, bring your laptop, and fix this. If you do not hand over those contacts today, your father is going to involve our attorneys. We will sue you for intellectual property theft." The threat hung in the air, heavy and desperate. They were trying to use legal intimidation to extract the unwritten, unspoken currency of trust I had built. They thought a lawyer could force a fisherman to answer a phone call. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "Mother," I said quietly, "you cannot subpoena a handshake." I ended the call and blocked her number. The opening skirmish was over. The shelves were empty, the morning revenue was lost, and my brother was standing in a bespoke suit surrounded by angry customers. But the real storm was just forming on the horizon. Colin, realizing he could not force the suppliers to respect him, was about to make a desperate move that would cross a legal line, handing me the exact ammunition I needed to dismantle his inheritance piece by piece. Wednesday morning arrived, with a biting chill that swept across the Narragansett Bay, rattling the window panes of the small Providence Cafe where I sat. I claimed a corner booth, nursing a bitter black espresso, while my laptop hummed quietly on the reclaimed wood table. I was already 3 steps ahead of my family. I spent the early hours filing the articles of organization for a new independent provisioning firm, routing the paperwork through my registered agent to keep my name out of the public directories for a few more days. I needed a clean slate, a fresh corporate entity to capture the elite clientele I knew would inevitably jump ship. My fingers tapped a steady rhythm across the keyboard. The coffee shop smelled of roasted beans and damp wool from the morning commuters rushing through the doors. Just as I submitted the final state registry fee, a high-priority notification flashed across my screen. It was an automated email from an elite seafood and truffle importer based in Boston, a vendor I had utilized for over a decade to source rare ingredients for the mega yachts docked in Newport. The subject line read, "Invoice confirmation for overnight freight." I set my ceramic mug down. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the attached PDF document. The purchase order detailed $42,000 worth of highly perishable luxury goods. Russian caviar, Alba white truffles, and premium-grade Wagyu beef cuts. The shipping address was my former storefront. The billing profile was linked to the legacy vendor portal, and right there, at the bottom of the digital contract, was my typed signature, authorizing the transaction under my personal guarantor profile. Colin had forged my identity. To comprehend why my brother thought he could execute such a brazen maneuver, you have to look at the history of his consequences. When he failed out of his first university, my father did not ground him or cut his allowance. Instead, my father hired a pricey educational consultant to quietly erase the academic probation and slide Colin into a second-tier business program. When Colin totaled his brand new sports car by driving it into a retaining wall after a frat party, our mother handled the police report, ensuring the incident disappeared under a veil of generous town donations. Colin grew up in a reality where rules were mere suggestions, and obstacles could always be bought off or buried by our parents. He viewed fraud not as a crime, but as a clever shortcut. He was standing in a barren retail space, with wealthy chefs demanding products he did not have. Instead of doing the grueling work of sourcing new vendors, he logged into my saved profiles on the back office computer, assumed my identity, and placed a desperate high-dollar order to save face. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line for Vincent, the regional director of the importing firm. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and professional. "Good morning," Charlene Vincent said. "I saw your expedited order come through the system. We are packing the insulated crates right now for the afternoon freight run." "Vincent, I need you to halt the loading process immediately," I replied. My tone remained entirely flat, betraying zero panic. "I did not authorize that purchase order. I resigned from the family business yesterday. The person operating that storefront is my younger brother, Colin. He used my saved credentials to push that invoice through." A heavy, static-filled silence stretched across the line. Vincent dealt in high-stakes perishables. A delayed shipment meant thousands of dollars in spoiled product. A fraudulent order meant someone was going to face a severe financial penalty. "Are you telling me this is a case of identity theft?" Vincent asked, his professional warmth evaporating into cold calculation. "I am telling you that I will not be honoring the guarantor agreement on that specific invoice I clarified. However, I need a favor. Do not cancel the order in your system just yet. Freeze the physical shipment on your loading dock, but send me the digital footprint. I need the IP address, the timestamp, and the exact device signature used to finalize the checkout." Vincent understood the assignment. He was a seasoned businessman who despised amateur hour. "You will have the data logs in your inbox in 5 minutes," he said. "Let me know when you are ready to set up a new account for yourself. I prefer doing business with the adult in the room." The moment the call ended, the data files appeared in my email. The IP address matched the secure network at the store. The timestamp read 8:14 in the morning. I downloaded the files, converted them into a secured, read-only format, and dropped them into a designated folder on my hard drive. Colin had just handed me irrefutable evidence of federal wire fraud. Yet the forged invoice triggered a secondary, far more dangerous realization. If Colin still had access to the legacy purchasing portals, he also had access to the commercial banking profiles linked to the main operating account. When I first took over the failing shop 15 years ago, I had to use my own pristine credit score to co-sign the revolving lines of credit. My personal assets were still tethered to the sinking ship my parents had just handed to a captain who did not know how to steer. I packed my laptop, left my half-empty espresso on the table, and walked briskly to my car. The wind whipped my coat around my knees as I navigated the coastal highway toward the local maritime bank branch. The gray sky mirrored the cold, tactical state of my mind. I walked into the financial institution and requested an immediate audience with Diane, the senior branch manager. She welcomed me into her glass-walled office, gesturing toward a plush leather guest chair. "Charlene, it is always a pleasure," Diane said, folding her hands on her pristine desk. "How is the retail traffic holding up this season?" "I am no longer affiliated with the storefront," I stated plainly. "I am here to sever my financial liabilities. I need my name, my social security number, and my personal guarantor status removed from all operating accounts, vendor credit lines, and emergency overdraft protections associated with the business, effective immediately. Diane raised an eyebrow, her fingers flying across her keyboard to pull up the portfolio. Her eyes scanned the dual monitors, and her posture stiffened. "This is incredibly timely," Charlene Diane murmured, turning one of the monitors slightly toward me. "Your brother was in this exact branch less than 2 hours ago. He submitted an application to increase the revolving commercial credit line by $100,000. He used your historical sales data from the past 5 years to justify the expansion." My jaw tightened. Colin was not just trying to buy luxury caviar. He was attempting to leverage my decade and a half of sweat equity to secure a massive cash infusion, presumably to cover the operational hemorrhage he had already caused in a single day. Since the application requires the signature of the primary guarantor, which is you, the system flagged it for review, Diane explained. He told the loan officer you were sick at home, and he was acting as your proxy. "Deny the application," I instructed, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "And execute the severance protocols. Remove my credit from his reach." Diane nodded, printing out a thick stack of legal release forms. I spent the next 20 minutes signing my name in blue ink, systematically cutting the financial umbilical cord. I watched as Diane updated the master database, locking Colin out of the pristine credit rating I had spent my entire adult life protecting. He was now operating on the store's baseline metrics, which, without my management, were essentially worthless. I left the bank feeling lighter, but my phone vibrated before I even reached my car. I glanced at the screen. It was an urgent text message from the chief estate manager of a sprawling Newport compound, one of my highest-paying, most demanding clients. The message read, "Charlene, why did your store just email me a preemptive invoice for $20,000? The new kid is demanding an upfront retainer for the summer season, claiming it is your new corporate policy. My chef is furious. Call me immediately." I stopped in the middle of the parking lot. The cold wind bit at my cheeks. Colin, having failed to secure the bank loan, was now trying to extort cash directly from my most loyal patrons. He was sending out fraudulent bills under the family name, threatening the very relationships I needed for my new venture. He was no longer just burning his own inheritance. He was actively trying to scorch the earth beneath my feet. The drive to Ocean Drive took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into an alternate dimension. The coastal road wound along the jagged cliffs of the Atlantic, where the winter waves crashed against the dark rocks, sending plumes of freezing saltwater spray into the gray air. This stretch of Rhode Island was lined with Gilded Age mansions, sprawling stone fortresses hidden behind towering wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. These properties were not just homes. They were private ecosystems that required a constant stream of high-tier logistics to function. I pulled up to the security checkpoint of a limestone compound that belonged to a prominent tech billionaire. Nathaniel, the chief estate manager, was waiting for me near the guardhouse. He wore a tailored wool overcoat, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his posture rigid with uncharacteristic stress. Over the past 6 years, I had provisioned every major gala, private dinner, and summer retreat this estate hosted. We operated on mutual respect and unbreakable punctuality. Nathaniel did not even offer a greeting. He simply turned on his heel and gestured for me to follow him up the sweeping gravel driveway toward the service entrance. "Walk with me, Charlene," he said, his boots crunching against the crushed stone. "I have a dinner party for 40 guests tonight. The menu requires fresh white asparagus, diver scallops, and local microgreens. I sent my procurement list to your shop at 6 this morning. Instead of a delivery confirmation, I received an extortion letter from a boy who looks like he belongs in a college fraternity." We stepped into the cavernous stainless steel commercial kitchen. The room was a symphony of culinary chaos. Chef Henri, a man whose talent was matched only by his formidable temper, was standing over a gleaming prep table staring at an empty walk-in refrigerator. He threw a copper whisk into the sink, the metal clattering loudly against the basin. "Henri is preparing to walk out," Nathaniel murmured, handing me a silver tablet. "Read this." I looked at the glowing screen. Colin had sent an email using the official storefront letterhead. The text was drenched in corporate buzzwords and unearned authority. It read, "Dear valued client, under our new executive management structure, we are implementing a premium service protocol. To secure your priority status for the upcoming season, we require a non-refundable retainer of $20,000 payable immediately by wire transfer. Routine deliveries will be suspended until this new policy is acknowledged and funded." A cold laugh caught in my throat. Colin was treating elite maritime clients like desperate retail shoppers. He believed wealth operated on intimidation, failing to realize that billionaires did not pay retainers to grocery clerks. They paid for invisible, seamless perfection. Nathaniel crossed his arms. "I do not respond well to hostage tactics, Charlene. If your family thinks they can hold my dinner party for ransom, I will terminate the vendor contract and blacklist the shop across every estate on this peninsula." I handed the tablet back to him, my expression betraying zero panic. "You should terminate the contract, Nathaniel," I replied, my voice steady and measured. "My parents transferred ownership of the storefront to Colin yesterday morning. I resigned immediately. That email is a desperate attempt to generate cash flow because half the local suppliers cut him off before sunrise. He has no scallops, he has no asparagus, and he has no leverage." Nathaniel stared at me, processing the shift in the landscape. His frustration melted into calculated assessment. He was a professional problem solver, and he recognized a sinking ship when he saw one. "Then we have a severe logistical problem for tonight," he stated. "We do not have a problem," I corrected him. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and opened the digital registry files I had finalized at the cafe. "I formed an independent procurement firm this morning. The storefront was just a building. The network belongs to me." I did not wait for his approval. I dialed the direct cell phone number of a boutique greenhouse operator in South Kingstown. The call connected on the first ring. I requested 3 flats of microgreens and a specialty harvest of white asparagus, offering a 20% premium for a rush delivery directly to the estate service gate by 4 in the afternoon. I then texted Elias, the fisherman who had refused to leave his catch for Colin. I instructed him to route 20 pounds of diver scallops to the same address, guaranteeing payment upon delivery. I placed my phone on the stainless steel counter and looked at Henri the chef, whose frantic pacing had slowed as he listened to my rapid-fire logistics. "Your ingredients will be at the loading bay in exactly 3 hours, Henri," I said. "You can start prepping your stations." Henri exhaled a long, heavy breath, offering a rare, genuine nod of approval. Nathaniel tapped the screen of his tablet, permanently deleting the email from Colin. "Send me your new vendor packet," Charlene Nathaniel said, the tension leaving his shoulders. "You have the exclusive contract for the compound. I will personally inform the other estate managers on Ocean Drive that your family shop is under hostile, incompetent management." Before I could express my gratitude, the intercom on the kitchen wall buzzed. The security guard from the front gate crackled through the speaker. "Mr. Nathaniel, we have a situation at the perimeter. A young man in a blue BMW is blocking the entrance. He says his name is Colin, and he insists he has an urgent executive meeting with you regarding an unpaid invoice." I stepped toward the wall-mounted security monitor. The grainy camera feed displayed my younger brother pacing aggressively outside his vehicle. He was gesturing wildly at the reinforced iron gate, shouting something the microphone could not pick up. He wore his stiff suit, but his tie was askew and his manicured facade was cracking under the weight of his failing empire. He had driven out here to do damage control, realizing too late that his extortion email had been met with deafening silence. Nathaniel did not even look at the screen. "Deny entry," he ordered into the intercom. "If he refuses to move his vehicle, call the local towing authority. He is trespassing." I watched the monitor as the guard delivered the message. Colin froze. He kicked the front tire of his expensive car, his face contorting in an undignified tantrum. He snatched his cell phone from his pocket and began dialing frantically. He was calling our father. The realization that he could not bully his way through an iron gate was forcing him to run back to the people who had always shielded him from reality. I thanked Nathaniel, shook his hand to seal our new partnership, and exited through the service corridor. I felt a surge of quiet triumph as I walked toward the employee parking area. I had just secured my first anchor client, dismantled Colin's extortion attempt, and established my new firm in a matter of hours. I climbed into my refrigerated transit van. I had purchased the vehicle 3 years ago using my own savings, modifying the cargo bay to transport high-end perishables. It was the backbone of my delivery network. However, for insurance tax benefits, my father had insisted on holding the legal title under the legacy corporate umbrella. It was a technicality I had never bothered to correct, prioritizing operational efficiency over paperwork. I started the engine, the heavy diesel motor rumbling beneath my seat. I pulled out of the service road, leaving the limestone estate behind, and merged onto the winding coastal highway. The heater blasted warm air against my frozen fingers. My mind was already calculating the evening route, planning the pickup schedules for the scallops and the produce. I was 2 miles down the road, navigating a sharp curve bordered by dense winter pines, when my rear-view mirror erupted in a flash of blinding red and blue lights. A state police cruiser was riding my bumper, the siren issuing a sharp, commanding chirp. My pulse spiked. I tapped the brakes, pulling the heavy transit van onto the narrow gravel shoulder. The cruiser parked at an aggressive angle behind me, effectively boxing me in against the guardrail. I placed my hands firmly on the steering wheel, my breath catching in my throat as 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. They did not approach with the casual demeanor of a routine traffic stop. Their hands rested near their utility belts, their postures alert and defensive. The lead officer tapped sharply on my window. I rolled the glass down, letting the freezing ocean wind tear through the warm cabin. "License and registration?" the officer commanded, his tone clipped and serious. "Keep your hands where I can see them." I retrieved my wallet, slowly, handing him my driver license. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Was I speeding?" The officer glanced at my identification, then looked back at me, his expression hardening into professional suspicion. "No, ma'am," he replied, his gaze sweeping the interior of the cab. "We received an emergency dispatch 10 minutes ago. The registered owner of this commercial vehicle just reported it stolen. I need you to step out of the van." The cold air hit my lungs like shattered glass. My parents were not just covering for Colin. They were actively weaponizing law enforcement to drag me out of my own vehicle, aiming to paralyze my logistics before my new business could even take its first breath. The blue lights from the cruiser painted the frosted window panes of the transit van in sharp, alternating flashes. The officer standing beside my door had his thumb resting lightly on the strap of his holster, his eyes narrowing as he waited for me to comply with his command. The cold wind blowing off the Atlantic whipped my hair across my face, but I kept my hands locked firmly on the top of the steering wheel. I knew the rules of the road, and I knew how quickly a domestic dispute weaponized through a 911 call could escalate into an unnecessary arrest. To understand why my own parents would call the state police to report a vehicle they had gifted to me for my business operations, you have to look at the way they managed power. In our household, property was never truly a gift. It was a leash. When I turned 25 and successfully negotiated our first major commercial supply contract with the Newport Yacht Club, my father handed me the keys to this exact van. He made a grand speech in front of the family about investing in my future, smiling for photographs that he later framed and hung in the hallway. But he never transferred the title out of the Legacy Corporation's name. It was a subtle insurance policy, a hidden legal string designed to jerk me back whenever I wandered too far from their control. They assumed that without the van I was stranded. They thought they could clip my wings before I even learned how to fly on my own terms. I turned my head slowly toward the officer, keeping every movement deliberate and non-threatening. I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hum of the cruiser engine. The vehicle is registered to the Legacy Holding Company, but I am the primary operator and officer of record for the account. My father filed that report knowing full well I was using it for active business logistics. The officer did not relax his posture, but he did pause, processing my calm demeanor. People who are genuinely stealing vehicles rarely sit with their hands on the wheel, offering administrative explanations. They panic, they argue, they threaten. "Step out of the van, ma'am," the officer repeated, though his tone lost a fraction of its aggressive edge. "Let us talk on the shoulder." I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the gravel. The freezing air bit at my ankles through my trousers, but I stood straight, looking the officer directly in the eye. I reached into my coat pocket with 2 fingers moving at half speed and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and brought up the digital paper trail I had secured earlier that morning at the bank and the cafe. "I am in the middle of executing a legally binding corporate transition," I explained, handing him the screen. "Here is my digital resignation letter, time-stamped from yesterday morning. Here are the bank records showing I severed my personal credit guarantees from the corporate accounts. And here is the commercial invoice for the perishable luxury goods, currently sitting in the refrigerated cargo bay, bound for an event on Ocean Drive under my new firm's contract." The officer looked down at the phone, scrolling through the documents with a practiced eye. He was a veteran state trooper, a man who had spent decades mediating coastal disputes between wealthy summer residents and local merchants. He could spot a retaliatory family feud from a mile away. "Your father is David Jung?" the trooper asked, reading my name off the digital signature. "The very same," I replied. The trooper let out a long, slow breath through his nose, forming a small cloud of steam in the bitter air. He handed my phone back to me and shook his head, a faint trace of professional exasperation crossing his weathered features. "Mr. Jung called the barracks 10 minutes ago, claiming a disgruntled former employee had hijacked his company truck," the trooper said, his voice dropping into a conversational register. "He did not mention that the former employee was his own daughter, and he certainly did not mention that you were in the middle of a corporate restructuring. Because if he had told you the truth, this would be classified as a civil property dispute, rather than a criminal grand theft auto report, and dispatch would have told him to handle it in court," I pointed out. The trooper glanced back at his partner still sitting in the cruiser, then looked at the heavy diesel engine of my van. He knew he had been used as a pawn in a domestic harassment campaign. State police troopers do not like being lied to, especially when it pulls them away from actual public safety duties to settle a petty family vendetta. "Well, Miss Jung," the trooper said, adjusting his belt and stepping back a half step, "your paperwork checks out, and you are clearly operating in good faith. I am not impounding this vehicle. However, since the legal title is still tied to the corporate holding entity, your father can technically continue to make life difficult for you through civil channels. If he wants this van back, he needs to file the proper injunctions through a judge, not through my emergency dispatch line." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling a surge of vindication. "Thank you, officer. I will handle the title transfer through legal counsel tomorrow." The trooper nodded, gave me a polite tip of his hat, and walked back to his cruiser. Within seconds, the red and blue flashing lights clicked off, and the vehicle pulled a U-turn across the narrow coastal road, heading back toward the highway. I stood alone on the gravel shoulder for a moment, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. My parents had played their heaviest card within the first 34 hours, and it had completely failed. They had attempted to use the full weight of the law to crush me, and instead, they had merely exposed the desperate, flailing nature of their strategy. I climbed back into the driver's seat, started the heavy diesel engine, and pulled back onto the asphalt. My phone began to vibrate almost immediately on the dashboard mount. The caller ID flashed a private number, but the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. I tapped the speakerphone button and answered. "Charlene, where in God's name are you?" My father's voice boomed through the cabin speakers, dripping with unfiltered fury. "The state police barracks just called me back to say they refused to arrest you. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? I am a pillar of this community, and my own daughter is driving around in my commercial vehicle like a common criminal." I kept my eyes fixed on the winding winter road, my voice smooth and untouched by his anger. "You called the police on me, Dad," I said, letting the weight of the words hang in the quiet cabin. "You reported your own daughter for grand theft auto because I refused to hand over my professional relationships to Colin? That is not a community pillar move. That is an act of desperation. Colin needs that van for deliveries," my father snarled, his voice cracking slightly with stress. "The store is falling apart. The shelves are empty. The Newport estate managers are canceling their contracts, and your brother has no idea how to manage the supply chain. You sabotaged him. You poisoned the well with every single vendor in the state." "I did not poison anything, Dad. I simply stopped carrying his weight," I corrected him. "Colin built his entire adult life on shortcuts and parental bailouts. You handed him a 15-year enterprise, assuming it ran on magic, and now reality is crashing down around him. If he cannot keep the doors open for 48 hours without stealing my identity for caviar or calling the police on my logistics, then the business never belonged to him in the first place." "Listen to me very carefully, Charlene," my father hissed, dropping his tone into a low, menacing threat. "If you do not return that van to the storefront by 5 o'clock this evening, and if you do not hand over your digital contact list to your brother, I'm going to disinherit you completely. I will rewrite my will tonight. Every cent of the family estate, every property, every cent of your mother's trust distribution that is scheduled to hit when you turn 35 next month will go to Colin. You will walk away with absolutely nothing." The threat was massive, calculated to strike terror into the heart of any child raised in our household. For years, the promise of the family inheritance was the invisible leash that kept us all in line, the ultimate reward for obedience and silent suffering. But sitting here in the cab of my own refrigerated van, driving toward my first independent delivery on Ocean Drive, the leash felt weightless. "Dad?" I said quietly, a faint smile touching my lips. "You cannot threaten to take away an inheritance I stopped counting on the moment you handed my store to a boy who cannot even run a cash register. Keep the money, keep the trust. I am already building something that cannot be legislated away by your bad temper." I tapped the screen, ending the call before he could formulate a response. I blocked his number right behind my mother's. The drive to the Ocean Drive estate was peaceful. When I pulled up to the service gate, Nathaniel and Chef Henri were waiting by the loading bay. We unloaded the fresh white asparagus, the microgreens, and the pristine diver scallops with military precision. The transition was seamless. Within an hour, the luxury kitchen was humming with activity, completely insulated from the chaos consuming my family's storefront 3 miles away. As I drove back toward Providence to finalize the incorporation documents for my new firm at my apartment desk, my phone buzzed one final time for the afternoon. It was an email notification from the commercial bank where I had severed my credit lines that morning. The subject line read, "Urgent notice regarding commercial loan application." I pulled over into a rest area overlooking the bay, tapped open the message, and began to read. The bank manager, Diane, was informing me that Colin, having been rejected for the $100,000 expansion loan earlier that day, had returned to the branch an hour ago with our mother. desperate for immediate cash to pay off the angry Boston seafood importer whose refrigerated truck was currently blocking their alleyway. Colin had attempted to forge our father's signature on a high-interest emergency bridge loan using the family home as collateral. The bank's fraud detection algorithms had flagged the signature discrepancy instantly. Security officers detained Colin and our mother in the lobby, while federal marshals were notified to review the documents for interstate wire fraud. My father's empire was not just failing. It was actively imploding under the weight of his favorite son's criminal incompetence, and the authorities were already walking through the front door. The cold, salt air hitting the windshield of my parked van did little to cool the sudden heat burning behind my eyes as I reread the bank alert. Colin had dragged our mother into a bank lobby to forge our father's name on a bridge loan, using the family house as collateral. My mind flashed back to my childhood dinners in that very house, a historic colonial built in the late 20s that my grandfather had spent 40 years paying off. My parents treated that property like a sacred monument to the Young legacy. Yet, in less than 48 hours of managing a business he knew nothing about, Colin had treated our ancestral home like a casino chip to cover a debt for caviar he could not sell. I put the van in gear and drove toward the downtown Providence Federal Building. My palms were steady on the leather steering wheel. I was no longer just protecting my personal credit or securing my new client roster. The storm my family had summoned was rapidly turning into a legal avalanche, and if I did not put my official statement on record before the federal prosecutor filed charges, my name could easily be swept into the indictment as a former corporate officer. To navigate the complex web of federal financial compliance, you need someone who understands how regulatory agencies operate. That person was my former college roommate, Sarah Vance. While Colin was spending his mid-20s getting kicked out of business programs and relying on our mother to clear his record, Sarah was grinding through law school at Georgetown, eventually becoming a corporate defense attorney, specializing in white-collar financial crimes. She knew every prosecutor in the district, and more importantly, she knew how to draw a sharp, impenetrable line between an innocent party and a sinking enterprise. I met Sarah in her office on the 16th floor of a granite tower overlooking the icy State House dome. The room smelled of expensive leather bindings and freshly brewed dark roast coffee. Floor-to-ceiling glass paneling captured the dimming afternoon light over the city. She did not waste time with casual pleasantries. She pulled up 2 chairs at a glass conference table and opened a crisp legal pad. "Give me the raw timeline," Charlene Sarah said, her pen poised over the paper, her voice radiating absolute sharp professionalism. I laid out the entire sequence. The forced resignation at the register, the forged Boston importer invoice, the bank severance forms I signed with Diane, the false stolen vehicle report my father filed with the state troopers, and finally, the emergency loan fraud Colin attempted with our mother 2 hours ago. I placed my phone on the table, displaying the time-stamped data logs, the bank confirmation notices, and the audio recording of my father threatening to disinherit me while trying to force me to hand over my proprietary contact lists. Sarah listened without interrupting, her pen moving across the pad in swift, precise shorthand. When I finished, she leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair, her gaze fixed on the glowing screen of my phone. "Your brother is in catastrophic legal jeopardy," Charlene Sarah stated, her tone measured and cool. Forging a corporate officer's electronic signature on a $42,000 interstate purchase order crosses into federal wire fraud. Attempting to execute a second fraudulent loan application using forged land deeds at a federally insured financial institution elevates the matter into bank fraud. The federal marshals detaining them in the lobby was not an overreaction. It was standard protocol for an active financial crime caught in real time. "What is my exposure?" I asked directly. "If we remain silent," High Sarah answered, without flinching, Your father filed a false police report alleging you stole corporate assets. If Colin's defense attorney tries to argue that you left the business in financial disarray or that you authorized these transactions before resigning, a prosecutor might view you as a co-conspirator. Until proven otherwise, we need to execute an immediate, preemptive strike. What do you suggest? We file a formal declaration of non-involvement with the United States Attorney's Office before 5 o'clock today. Sarah explained, pulling a stack of legal forms from her briefcase. We submit your time-stamped resignation letter, the bank release forms showing you severed your personal guarantees, and the digital logs proving Colin accessed your saved credentials after you walked out. We turn your evidence over to the federal investigator as a cooperating witness. We insulate you completely before the grand jury convenes. Signing a formal declaration against my own brother and mother was a line I had never envisioned crossing when I woke up 2 days ago. In a traditional family, such an act would be viewed as an unforgivable betrayal. But my family had severed those bonds the moment they handed my life's labor to a fraudster and used the state police as a personal weapon to hijack my delivery van. They had chosen war. I was simply choosing the terms of my defense. I took the fountain pen Sarah offered, leaned over the mahogany table, and signed my name on the federal witness declaration forms in dark blue ink. While Sarah's assistant ran the documents down to the clerk's office, my phone rang again. The screen displayed an unknown landline number from a local area code. I knew instantly it was coming from the holding facility at the municipal court complex. I tapped the speaker button, placing the phone between Sarah and me on the glass table. This is a prepaid collect call from an inmate at the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, an automated voice droned through the speaker. Accept or decline. I tapped the keypad to accept. Charlene? My mother's voice shrieked through the line, choked with tears, hysteria, and raw panic. Charlene, you have to help us. They have Colin in a holding cell. They took my purse, they took my jewelry, and they are threatening to process him into the state facility tonight. Your father is refusing to come down here because he is terrified of the press seeing his car outside the courthouse. I kept my breathing steady, looking across the table at Sarah, who was silently taking notes. Mother, why did you go to the bank with Colin? I asked, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. He needed a co-signer, Charlene, she sobbed, her composure entirely shattered. The Boston Seafood Company was threatening to file criminal charges over the caviar order if we did not wire the money by 4 o'clock. Colin said he just needed Dad's signature to unlock the emergency credit line. He said you used to do it all the time. I never forged a signature in my life, Mother, I replied coldly. I built a legitimate credit rating over 15 years of hard labor. You and Colin committed bank fraud. It was an emergency, she screamed into the receiver. You caused this when you walked out. If you had just stayed and helped your brother, none of this would have happened. You need to call your friend at the bank right now and tell her it was a family misunderstanding. Tell her you gave Colin permission to sign those papers. The sheer unyielding refusal to accept responsibility was breathtaking. Even while sitting in a detention room facing federal financial charges, my mother was still trying to rewrite reality to shield her favorite son, expecting me to commit perjury to save them from their own criminal choices. I will not lie to a federal officer for you, Mother, I said, each word landing like a heavy iron door slamming shut. I just signed a formal affidavit with the United States Attorney. My legal team has turned over the digital audit trail showing Colin stole my credentials and forged those documents. I am a cooperating federal witness. A sharp, gasping silence fell over the line. For 5 seconds, the only sound coming through the speaker was the static of the correctional facility phone line. You gave evidence against your own brother, my mother whispered, her voice dropping into a horrifying, hollow register. You are destroying this family over a store. You destroyed this family when you handed my life's work to a thief and called the police to arrest me on the highway. I told her, do not call this number again. I pressed the red button, cutting the line mid-sentence. Sarah looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. "That was the hardest part, Charlene," she said gently. "You just stripped away their last illusion of control." We finalized the filings and I left the granite tower as the winter sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Providence skyline in bruised shades of purple and orange. The city lights began to flicker on along the riverwalk. I felt an undeniable sense of closure. The legal shield was in place. My reputation was protected. My new logistics business was already generating revenue. I walked to my van, ready to return to my apartment and plan the expansion of my independent client network for the upcoming spring season. I opened the driver's side door, threw my briefcase onto the passenger seat, and reached for the ignition key. Before my fingers touched the slot, a shadow moved swiftly from the side of the parking structure. A tall figure stepped into the light of the overhead sodium lamp, blocking the driver's door from closing. It was my father. His face was gray, his hair unkempt, his tailored overcoat unbuttoned against the freezing wind. His eyes were bloodshot, tracking my movements with an erratic, dangerous intensity. He was no longer the poised, untouchable community pillar who had handed my keys away at the register 2 days ago. He looked like a man who had watched his entire life catch fire and had finally realized he was standing in the middle of the flames. "Get out of the car, Charlene," my father commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of desperate authority and unhinged rage. "We are going to talk right now, and you are going to fix what you just did to your mother and brother before I burn everything else to the ground." The sodium lights in the parking garage cast long, distorted shadows across the concrete pillars. My father stood inches from my open door, his chest heaving under his tailored wool overcoat. He smelled of stale scotch and sharp fear, a potent combination that stripped away the refined country club veneer he had cultivated for decades. His hand gripped the frame of my door, knuckles turning white under the strain. He was trying to project authority, but his erratic breathing gave him away. He was not a king issuing a decree. He was a drowning man, looking for someone to pull under the water with him. To truly comprehend David Young, you have to picture the mahogany dining room of the Newport Yacht Club on a Saturday evening. For my entire life, my father sat at the head of those elite tables, swirling expensive bourbon soaking in the admiration of local politicians and real estate developers. He loved to regale his peers with tales of his thriving maritime supply business. He never once mentioned that his daughter was the one awake at 3 a.m, negotiating freight rates with exhausted fishermen. He hoarded the prestige while outsourcing the labor. His entire identity rested on the illusion that he was a self-made titan of coastal commerce. Tonight, that illusion was sitting in a federal holding cell. "Get out of the car, Charlene," my father ordered, his voice echoing sharply against the concrete ceiling. "We are going to march right back up to that elevator, and you are going to tell your lawyer friend to shred whatever federal documents you just signed." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I looked at the man who had filed a false, stolen vehicle report against me just hours prior. "I cannot unring a bell, Dad," I said, my tone smooth and detached. "The United States Attorney already has the digital audit trail. The time-stamped logs prove Colin stole my credentials to commit wire fraud. The bank's surveillance cameras show him and Mother forging your signature on a commercial bridge loan. My statement merely confirms I am not a co-conspirator." "You are my daughter," he spat, leaning closer, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are supposed to protect this family. You are going to call the bank manager right now. You are going to tell her I gave Colin verbal authorization to sign that loan on my behalf. We will clear the fraud charges, pay off the Boston importer, and handle this internally." The audacity of his demand hung in the freezing air. He was ordering me to orchestrate a cover-up that would implicate both of us in a federal banking crime. He wanted me to risk a prison sentence to save a brother who had tried to extort my clients and a mother who had cheered him on. I reached out and tapped the small black dashboard camera mounted behind my rearview mirror. A tiny red light blinked steadily in the dim cabin. This unit records audio and high-definition video to a remote cloud server the moment the engine turns on, I explained quietly. I am currently recording you demanding that I assist in covering up a federal bank fraud investigation. My father froze. His eyes darted to the blinking red light. The hand gripping my doorframe twitched, but he did not pull away. Think about the sheer logistics of what you are asking, I continued, leaning slightly toward him, my voice dropping into a register of pure, icy logic. If you tell the federal marshals that you authorized that bridge loan, you are legally assuming the debt. You are taking responsibility for the money Colin tried to borrow against your ancestral home. The bank will hold you liable for the defaulted caviar invoice. The federal investigators will subpoena your personal tax returns to verify your assets. Your country club friends will read all about your financial collapse in the morning paper. Are you truly prepared to sacrifice your pristine reputation and your estate to bail out a son who crashed your business in 2 days? I watched the psychological gears grind behind his eyes. My father was a narcissist of the highest order. He loved Colin because Colin was an extension of his own ego, a male heir to carry the Jung legacy. But faced with the tangible threat of losing his wealth, his social standing, and his colonial mansion, the unconditional parental love evaporated. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He could not save his wife and son without destroying himself. His posture deflated. The imposing patriarch vanished, leaving behind a hollow, aging man staring at a blinking red dashboard light. He slowly removed his hand from my doorframe, taking a half-step back onto the oily concrete. "You set them up," he whispered, his voice trembling with a dark, bitter resentment. "You walked out, knowing Colin would panic. You knew he would make a mistake." "Colin did not make a mistake," I corrected him. "He made a choice. He chose to forge my name. He chose to forge your name. You spent his entire life teaching him that rules do not apply to our bloodline. The federal government disagrees." I reached for the heavy door handle and pulled it shut. The solid thud of the metal closing severed the conversation. I rolled the window up, sealing myself inside the warm, insulated cabin of the transit van. I shifted into drive and pulled out of the parking space, leaving my father standing alone in the dim garage, trapped in a cage built entirely by his own parenting. The drive back to my apartment was silent. The adrenaline that had kept my mind razor-sharp all day began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. I had survived the opening onslaught. My legal shield was intact. My primary transport vehicle was secured, and my anchor client on Ocean Drive was expecting a seamless delivery schedule by the end of the week. I parked the van, locked the doors, and went straight to bed, falling into a dreamless, heavy sleep. The peace lasted exactly 12 hours. I woke up the next morning to the sound of rain lashing against my bedroom window. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and sat at my kitchen island, opening my laptop to review the final incorporation documents for my new firm. The digital paperwork was pristine. Then my cell phone chimed with an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately. It was Gregory, a senior commercial real estate broker in Providence. Gregory had handled the lease renewals for my family's storefront for over a decade. He was a sharp, pragmatic operator who traded in local market intelligence. "Good morning, Gregory," I answered, taking a sip of my steaming coffee. Charlene Gregory said, his tone lacking his usual cheerful cadence. He sounded rushed, his words clipping together with urgent precision. "I heard the rumors about the shakeup at the storefront. I also just received a very disturbing phone call from your father. I felt you deserved a warning given our history." I set my mug down on the granite counter. "What did my father do?" "He is liquidating the retail space," Gregory explained. "He listed the property for a high-speed commercial lease at dawn. He bypassed the standard local vetting process and went straight to a national corporate brokerage. He just signed a 10-year exclusivity agreement with Atlantic Provisions. The name hit my ears like a siren. Atlantic Provisions was not a local shop. They were a multi-billion-dollar grocery conglomerate known for flooding affluent coastal towns with aggressive retail tactics. They did not just sell high-end food. They suffocated independent local markets. Your father gave them the keys an hour ago, Gregory continued, his voice grim. He gave them the prime waterfront location, the upgraded refrigeration units you installed, and the loading dock access. But that is not the worst part, Charlene. I braced myself, my eyes narrowing at the rain-slicked window. Tell me. Atlantic Provisions operates on predatory supply exclusivity, Gregory warned. They are deploying a team of corporate buyers to Rhode Island this afternoon. They plan to visit every artisanal farm, local baker, and independent fisherman in the state. They are going to offer your suppliers massive upfront cash bonuses to sign non-compete contracts. If your vendors sign with Atlantic, they will be legally barred from selling their goods to your new firm. Your father is not just trying to replace you. He invited a corporate predator into our harbor to starve you out. The rain lashed against my kitchen window, tracing erratic paths down the glass as Gregory ended the call. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, charged with the sudden, sharp reality of corporate warfare. My father had not just leased the building. He had sold the entire local ecosystem to a predator. Atlantic Provisions did not compete. They consumed. Their business model involved moving into a wealthy coastal enclave, identifying the premium independent suppliers, and offering them enormous upfront cash bonuses to sign predatory exclusivity contracts. Once the local artisans signed, the independent shops starved, leaving the conglomerate as the sole provider. Then they quietly squeezed the suppliers, dropping wholesale prices until the farmers and fishermen were trapped in a cycle of debt. I did not have time to sit and process the betrayal. I grabbed my waterproof jacket, snatched my keys from the counter, and ran down the stairs to the transit van. The engine roared to life, the diesel heater fighting the damp chill seeping through the floorboards. I threw the vehicle into gear and sped toward Point Judith. The harbor was a rugged stretch of Rhode Island coastline where the commercial fishing fleet moored alongside cold storage warehouses. This was the beating heart of my supply chain. For 15 years, I had cultivated relationships on these very docks. I knew the names of the deckhands, the seasonal shifts of the tide, and the exact weeks the winter storms made the ocean too dangerous to drag nets. When Elias blew a transmission on his primary boat 5 years ago, the local banks refused to issue a repair loan because his seasonal income fluctuated. I handed him a cashier check for $12,000 on a handshake. We never signed a single sheet of paper, and he paid me back in premium halibut over 2 seasons. Atlantic Provisions did not understand that kind of leverage. They thought loyalty could be printed on a corporate spreadsheet. I parked the van near the central processing warehouse, a sprawling corrugated metal building that smelled intensely of brine, wet wool, and diesel fuel. I pushed the heavy steel door open, the hinges groaning against the howling wind outside. Inside the cavernous space, under the harsh glare of fluorescent overhead lights, stood a gathering of my most critical vendors. Elias was there, leaning against a stack of wooden pallets, his arms crossed over his heavy waterproof overalls. Beside him stood Thomas, the director of the Organic Farm Cooperative, and Marcus, the artisanal baker who supplied our signature sourdough. In the center of this rugged circle stood a man who did not belong on a working harbor dock. He wore a tailored trench coat that repelled the damp air, polished leather shoes that carefully avoided the puddles of melting ice, and a calculated, pristine smile. He held an open Italian leather briefcase resting on a wooden crate. Inside the briefcase were stacks of crisp legal documents. This was the corporate buyer. I stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the circle, my boots echoing sharply against the concrete floor. "I hope I am not interrupting a private meeting," I said, keeping my voice smooth and loud enough to carry over the hum of the warehouse generators. Elias looked up, a grim expression etched into his weathered face. "Charlene, your father called us an hour ago. He said the storefront was under new management and instructed us to meet this gentleman to secure our seasonal contracts." The buyer turned to face me. He had the polished, unblinking stare of a man accustomed to bulldozing local opposition. "My name is Preston," he announced, offering a curt nod rather than a handshake. "I represent Atlantic Provisions. We are taking over the waterfront retail space. I am currently outlining our premium partnership program to these gentlemen." I walked right up to the wooden crate, stopping inches from his expensive briefcase. "And what exactly does a premium partnership entail, Preston?" Preston smirked, a gesture brimming with unearned confidence. "It entails a $50,000 signing bonus wired directly into their operating accounts by close of business today. In exchange, they agree to provide their goods exclusively to Atlantic Provisions for a term of 5 years. It is a win for everyone. They get immediate guaranteed capital, and we secure the finest local inventory for our new flagship location." I saw Thomas, the farm director, shift uncomfortably on his feet. $50,000 was a staggering sum for a local cooperative facing a harsh winter. It could buy new greenhouse heaters, repair delivery trucks, and provide a buffer against seasonal blight. The temptation was tangible. The air in the warehouse felt thick with the gravity of the decision. "That is a very generous number," I said, turning my gaze from Preston to Elias. "But I imagine a conglomerate like Atlantic Provisions does not hand out $50,000 without securing a substantial return on investment. Did Preston happen to read you the penalty clauses hidden in the fine print?" Preston stiffened, his polished smile faltering. "Miss Jung, this is a private negotiation." "These are my partners," I shot back my voice, turning into a razor. "You are standing on their dock, peddling a trap disguised as a lifeline." I reached into his open briefcase, bypassing his attempt to block my hand, and pulled out one of the glossy contracts. I flipped past the bold, attractive numbers on the first page, scanning the dense legal jargon buried in the middle of the document. I had spent a decade reviewing vendor agreements and corporate traps, always utilized the same generic phrasing. "Let us look at Section 4, Paragraph B," I read aloud, my voice echoing clearly. "The supplier agrees to meet mandatory quarterly volume quotas determined at the sole discretion of the buyer. In the event of a volume shortfall, the supplier is liable for liquidated damages equal to the retail value of the missing product." I lowered the paper and looked at Elias. "If a winter freeze keeps your boats docked for 3 weeks and you miss their arbitrary quota, they do not just cancel the contract. They fine you for the caviar and scallops you failed to pull out of the ocean." I turned a page, the paper rustling sharply in the quiet room. "How about Section 7 payment terms? The $50,000 is a signing bonus, yes, but the ongoing invoice structure switches to a net 120-day payout after the first 6 months. They are going to make you wait 4 months to get paid for a halibut you caught today. Can your deckhands wait 4 months for their paychecks, Elias? Can your farmhands survive a delayed harvest payout, Thomas?" Preston reached out and snatched the contract from my hand, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You are misrepresenting standard corporate safeguards." "I am translating your corporate extortion," I corrected him, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to lean back. "You lock them into exclusivity. You impose impossible quotas, and when they inevitably fall short due to unpredictable weather, you seize their assets to cover the damages by year 3. Atlantic Provisions will own the boats, the greenhouses, and the bakeries." I turned my back to Preston, dismissing him entirely, and addressed the men I had worked alongside for my entire adult career. My father handed a corporate predator the keys to my shop because he wanted to punish me, I told them. Maintaining steady eye contact with each supplier, he is willing to sacrifice your livelihoods to settle a family dispute. I am not offering you a $50,000 signing bonus today, but I am offering you the exact same terms we have honored for 15 years. Fair market value, paid on delivery, zero exclusivity clauses, and absolute transparency. I have a new independent firm. I already secured the Ocean Drive estates. You can sign with the suit and risk your boats, or you can load your trucks and ride with me. The silence in the warehouse stretched thick and heavy. The generators hummed. The rain beat against the metal roof. Elias reached into his waterproof overalls, pulled out a silver folding knife, and flicked the blade open. He took the fresh Atlantic Provisions contract he had been holding in his left hand, drove the blade right through the center of the glossy paper, and pinned it to the wooden crate. I do not do business with people who need 50 pages to promise me a fair price, Elias said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. He looked at Thomas and Marcus. Both men nodded in silent agreement. Elias turned to me. Where do you need the diver scallops this afternoon? Charles. Ocean Drive, Service Gate 3, I replied, a genuine warmth spreading through my chest. Preston grabbed his briefcase, his polished demeanor shattering into raw, venomous frustration. He snapped the latches shut, glaring at me with cold, calculating eyes. Your father warned us you were a stubborn nuisance, Preston hissed his voice, dropping into a sinister whisper. He also mentioned your new independent logistics rely entirely on a single refrigerated transit van. My pulse hitched, but I kept my face impassive. It would be a terrible shame, Preston continued, stepping toward the exit, if the State Department of Transportation received an anonymous tip about undocumented Freon modifications and unlicensed commercial weight distributions on that specific vehicle. Your brother was remarkably helpful in providing the structural blueprints to your van. Enjoy your victory today, Ms. Jung. Let us see how your luxury chefs react when the state impounds your only delivery truck at sunrise. Preston pushed the heavy steel door open and walked out into the freezing rain. The immediate threat of the corporate buyout was neutralized, but the war had just escalated into a new, terrifying arena. My family had handed a billion-dollar conglomerate the exact weapon needed to paralyze my operation, forcing me into a race against the regulatory clock. The sleet began to fall as I drove away from Point Judith, the ice crystals bouncing off the windshield like scattered gravel. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:15 in the evening. Sunrise was 8 hours away. Preston had promised a Department of Transportation ambush at dawn, armed with the exact mechanical blueprints my brother had handed over to a corporate predator. In the state of Rhode Island, commercial vehicle compliance is a rigid, unforgiving domain. If a DOT inspector found undocumented Freon modifications and structural weight imbalances on my transit van, they would not just issue a citation. They would impound the vehicle indefinitely, levy fines capable of bankrupting a new enterprise, and paralyze my logistics network on my first official day of independent operation. I needed to make the van disappear, but I also needed to execute a flawless delivery of diver scallops to Ocean Drive by 7 in the morning. Hiding was not a sustainable business model. I had to fundamentally alter the battlefield. I steered the van away from the coastal highway and headed toward an industrial park on the outskirts of Warwick. The sprawling complex was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and corrugated steel garages. I pulled up to a bay door, marked only by a faded painted anchor, and honked the horn twice. A moment later, the heavy metal door rattled upward on its tracks, revealing a brightly lit workshop filled with marine engines, welding tanks, and the sharp scent of ozone and grinding metal. Dominic stepped out, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. He was a former Coast Guard engineer who had transitioned into custom marine fabrication. 5 years ago, when a severe winter storm damaged his primary dry dock traditional banks, refused to extend him a line of credit. I had utilized the storefront surplus capital to prepay him for 2 years of equipment maintenance, floating his business through the hardest freeze of the decade. We never discussed the debt, but the loyalty between us was forged in iron. Dominic took one look at my face and hit the button to lower the bay door the second my rear bumper cleared the threshold. "What broke?" Charlene Dominic asked, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "Nothing broke," I replied, stepping out into the warm, brightly lit garage. "But I have a corporate buyer from Atlantic Provisions, aiming a DOT inspection at me for sunrise. My brother gave them the original structural blueprints to this van. They're going to flag the custom Freon compressor and the commercial weight distribution." Dominic walked around to the back of the van and opened the cargo doors. He stared at the refrigeration unit we had designed together 3 years prior. When my father originally refused to fund a proper commercial delivery vehicle, demanding I use a standard passenger van to save money, Dominic and I had installed a secondary compressor and reinforced the suspension under the radar. It was an engineering marvel, but it technically violated 3 different commercial hauling statutes if subjected to a targeted federal inspection. If they have the original schematics, they know exactly where the pressure valves and the auxiliary batteries are hidden, Dominic muttered, his eyes tracing the insulated ceiling panels. "We cannot hide the system from a motivated state inspector." "Then we do not hide it," I said, leaning against the cold metal of a nearby tool cabinet. "We remove it entirely." Dominic turned to look at me, his brow furrowing. "If I strip the compressor and pull the Freon lines, you have no active cooling. You are transporting premium seafood and organic produce. The inventory will spoil before you cross the Newport Bridge." "I do not need active cooling," I countered, my mind racing through the logistical alternatives. "I need thermal retention. If we gut the mechanical refrigeration system tonight, the vehicle drops 3,000 pounds. It reverts to a standard passenger cargo weight class immune to the commercial hazardous material statutes Preston plans to weaponize." Dominic scratched his beard, his engineering brain catching up to the tactical pivot. "We strip the mechanics and swap to a passive dry ice modular core. I have insulated aerospace bulkheads sitting in the back corner of the shop. If we seal the cargo bay and pack the base with dry ice pallets, the ambient temperature will hold at 34 degrees for 48 hours without a single moving part." "Can we finish it before dawn?" I asked. Dominic grabbed a heavy pneumatic wrench from the table. "Put a pot of coffee on the burner, Charlene. We are pulling an all-nighter." The next 6 hours were a blur of sparks, hissing pressure valves, and the heavy clank of metal hitting the concrete floor. We worked in tandem, driven by the ticking clock and the sheer necessity of survival. We drained the Freon into certified recovery tanks, unbolted the heavy compressor from the chassis, and ripped out the auxiliary wiring harnesses. By 3 in the morning, the cargo bay was an empty, echoing shell. Dominic then brought out the aerospace bulkheads, securing the lightweight, hyper-insulated panels to the interior walls. We loaded custom-slotted floorboards, designed to hold modular blocks of dry ice. By 5:30, the transformation was complete. The van looked identical on the outside, but internally, it was an entirely different machine. The hazardous chemicals were gone. The commercial weight penalty was erased. The vehicle was legally a standard passenger van hauling insulated coolers. I thanked Dominic, loaded the dry ice blocks, and drove to Point Judith to collect the scallops from Elias. The harbor was pitch black, the freezing wind whipping across the docks, but the inventory exchange was seamless. I packed the premium seafood into the new thermal core and headed back toward the coastal highway, aiming for Ocean Drive. The sky began to turn a bruised shade of violet as the sun crept toward the horizon. I merged onto Route 1A, keeping my speed exactly at the posted limit. I did not have to wait long. A mile past the Narragansett town line, a white SUV with amber light bars pulled out from a hidden median turnabout. The state DOT compliance cruiser accelerated rapidly, sliding directly behind my rear bumper. The siren chirped a short, sharp command. I engaged my blinker and pulled onto the wide gravel shoulder, putting the van in park. My pulse remained remarkably steady. I rolled down the window and waited as a stern-looking compliance officer approached, clutching a metal clipboard. Pinned beneath the clip were several sheets of architectural paper. Preston had indeed supplied them with the exact blueprints. "License registration and your commercial hauling manifest," the officer demanded, his breath forming clouds in the freezing dawn air. I handed him my standard driver license and the passenger vehicle registration. "I do not carry a commercial hauling manifest, officer," I replied smoothly. "This is a private, non-commercial passenger vehicle." The officer frowned, glancing down at the blueprints on his clipboard. "Do not play games, Miss Jung. We received a detailed report that this specific vehicle is operating with an unlicensed auxiliary freon compressor and an overloaded commercial suspension system. I need you to step aside so I can inspect the cargo bay." I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the van. "Be my guest," I said, gesturing toward the rear doors. The officer marched to the back, unlatched the heavy doors and swung them open, clearly expecting to find a hissing, illegal refrigeration unit. Instead, he stared into a pristine, silent cargo bay lined with lightweight aerospace panels. There were no wires, no compressor coils, and no hazardous chemical tanks. There was only a stack of highly insulated coolers resting on top of passive, dry ice vents. The officer blinked, looking from the empty ceiling to the blueprints in his hand. He walked around to the side of the vehicle, shining his heavy tactical flashlight underneath the chassis, searching for the auxiliary batteries Colin had detailed in the schematics. He found nothing but standard factory suspension components. "You have been misinformed, officer," I said, standing calmly on the gravel shoulder. "As you can see, there are no mechanical modifications, no freon hazards, and the vehicle is well below the commercial weight threshold." The officer stood up, his face flushing with a mix of professional embarrassment and deep irritation. He realized he had been dispatched on a wild goose chase based on false intelligence. The DOT takes a very dim view of citizens weaponizing their regulatory resources for personal vendettas. "Someone went to a great deal of trouble to file a fraudulent safety report," the officer muttered, slamming the cargo doors shut. "My apologies for the delay, Ms. Young. You are free to go. Have a safe morning." I watched the cruiser pull away, a profound sense of victory settling into my chest. The corporate guillotine Preston had designed had fallen on empty space. I climbed back into the driver's seat and completed the delivery to the Ocean Drive estate without a single disruption. As I pulled out of the private compound, ready to head home and finally sleep, my phone began to vibrate in the cup holder. The caller ID displayed my brother's name. I had not blocked Colin yet, curious to see how long it would take for his unearned arrogance to collapse. I pressed the answer button, expecting a barrage of insults or another demand for money. Instead, I heard the sound of ragged, desperate weeping. Charlene Colin choked out, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar, terrifying vulnerability. "Charlene, you have to come down to the storefront, please!" I shifted the van into gear, my face expressionless. "Why would I do that?" Colin begged. "Because they locked me out," he sobbed, the sound of heavy machinery echoing in the background over the phone line. "Atlantic Provisions changed the locks at midnight. Preston is standing on the sidewalk with a demolition crew. Dad did not read the lease agreement before he signed it. They are not taking over the store, Char. They are tearing the entire historic building down to build a parking lot for their new flagship supermarket next door. They are destroying it right now." I pressed the red button on my phone, ending the call and leaving Colin to weep into the empty morning air. I did not hit the accelerator. I did not rush. I steered the heavy transit van through the early Providence traffic with the exact same steady, measured pace I utilized for my daily deliveries. My father had spent my entire childhood worshiping the aesthetics of success while meticulously avoiding the exhausting labor required to sustain it. He viewed the historic waterfront storefront not as a living, breathing business, but as an ornamental monument to his own prestige. He assumed a corporate conglomerate would treat his monument with the same unearned reverence he demanded from his family. I wanted to be there to watch cold reality shatter that specific delusion. I parked the van 3 blocks away to avoid the congestion, walking the final stretch along the uneven cobblestone sidewalk. The freezing salt breeze rolling off the Atlantic usually carried the scent of roasted coffee and fresh sea spray. Today, it carried an unfamiliar, acrid odor. It was the distinct smell of pulverized mortar, crushed brick, and century-old cedar dust. I rounded the final corner and stopped. The retail space, a staple of the Rhode Island harbor since the early 1920s, was now surrounded by tall, chain-link fencing. 2 towering yellow excavators sat idling on the pavement, their hydraulic arms raised like steel predators waiting for a command. The polished mahogany sign bearing our family name, the sign I had personally restained every spring, lay fractured in the gutter, splintered into unreadable, jagged wooden shards. Colin sat on the concrete curb, his pristine bespoke suit stained with dark grease and wet dirt. He held his head in his trembling hands, openly sobbing. A few yards away, Preston stood underneath a black umbrella, flanked by 3 men wearing hard hats and bright reflective safety vests. Preston looked immaculate, sipping hot coffee from a white paper cup, watching the demolition preparations with cold administrative detachment. Tires screeched loudly down the block. My father's silver luxury sedan jumped the curb, halting inches from the chain-link barrier. He threw the heavy car door open and sprinted toward the perimeter fence. He wore a plush bathrobe over his dress trousers, his gray hair wild in the wind, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. The imposing, untouchable country club patriarch was gone. In his place stood a terrified, desperate old man, watching his legacy evaporate. "Stop the machines!" my father roared, his voice cracking sharply as he lunged toward the construction foreman. "You cannot do this! I leased you a retail space. I did not authorize a demolition!" Preston stepped forward, raising a gloved hand to signal the foreman to hold the perimeter line. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored trench coat and produced a folded legal document. "Good morning," David Preston said, his tone dripping with polished, polite condescension. "I highly suggest you lower your voice before the local authorities arrive to cite you for disturbing a municipal work zone." My father ignored the warning, grabbing the chain-link fence and rattling the metal links fiercely. "You are destroying my property!" he shouted, his knuckles turning white. "I signed a 10-year commercial lease for you to operate a high-end grocery. I am calling my attorneys right now to file an emergency injunction." Preston sighed slowly, unfolding the paper. He held it up, tapping a manicured finger against a highlighted paragraph near the bottom of the page. "You signed a commercial redevelopment lease," David Preston corrected him, emphasizing every single syllable. "Did you truly believe a multi-billion-dollar grocery conglomerate wanted your quaint, outdated brick building? We wanted the premium waterfront acreage. We wanted the exclusive loading dock access. Our new flagship supermarket is currently being constructed on the adjoining empty lot. Your historic building is merely in the way of our new customer parking structure." My father stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His eyes darted frantically across the dense legal text. "Section 8, Clause C," Preston read aloud, projecting his voice over the deep rumble of the diesel engines. "The lessee retains broad authority to optimize the site, including total structural clearance, provided the base rent is maintained." You were so incredibly eager to secure our upfront cash deposit, and so desperate to punish your daughter that you skipped the standard legal review. You handed us the deed, the demolition rights, and the legacy of your ancestors, all for a signature bonus you cannot even keep. My father released his grip on the fence. His knees buckled, sending him crashing onto the cold pavement beside Colin. He clutched his chest, struggling to pull freezing air into his lungs. He had traded a thriving 15-year enterprise for a few months of corporate rent, destroying the only tangible achievement his family possessed. I stepped out of the shadows and stood near the edge of the curb. Preston noticed my arrival and offered a tight, acknowledging nod. He had failed to trap my van at dawn, but he had succeeded in eradicating my family's physical foothold on the harbor. "You play a ruthless game, Preston," I said, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression entirely unreadable. "Corporate expansion leaves very little room for sentimentality, Miss Jung," he replied smoothly, adjusting his scarf. "I told you yesterday, Atlantic Provisions consumes the market. Your father made it remarkably easy. He unlocked the door from the inside and handed me the hammer." Preston turned to the foreman and gave a swift, downward motion with his hand. The hydraulic arm of the nearest excavator swung forward. The heavy steel bucket crashed into the brick facade of the storefront. The impact shook the ground beneath my boots. The large picture windows, the glass I'd cleaned every single morning for a decade and a half, shattered outward in a spectacular wave of sparkling fragments. The roof groaned, the ancient wooden joists snapping under the immense pressure. Within 60 seconds, the front half of the store collapsed into a heap of rubble, crushing the custom espresso machine and the cedar shelves into dust. Colin wailed, curling into a tight ball on the sidewalk. My father knelt in the dirt, weeping openly as the excavator took another enormous bite out of the structure. They were mourning the building, but they were also mourning their own reflection. Without the store to legitimize their arrogance, they were nothing but two failed men sitting in the ruins of their own incompetence. I watched the walls fall, and I felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The anchor that had tied me to their unreasonable demands was pulverized into concrete powder. I turned around and walked back toward my transit van. The coastal logistics network belonged to me now. My competitors were eradicated, my suppliers were loyal, and my thermal delivery system was flawless. But the war was not over. The destruction of the store merely shifted the battlefield from the harbor to the courtroom. I climbed into the driver's seat and checked the email app on my smartphone. A secure message waited for me from Sarah, my corporate defense attorney. The subject line commanded my immediate attention, marked with high priority flags. I opened the encrypted document. It was a formal notice of debt assignment. When my father and Colin attempted to forge the commercial bridge loan using the family colonial home as collateral, the bank flagged the fraud and halted the cash transfer. However, the initial application had initiated a hard credit inquiry, exposing the precarious, over-leveraged state of my father's personal finances to the central banking network. He had secretly borrowed against the house 3 times over the past decade to fund his lavish country club lifestyle, hiding the mounting debt behind the store's previous stable revenue. With the store gone and the revenue stream dead, the local bank immediately classified his residential mortgages as a critical default risk. Sarah's email detailed a terrifying corporate maneuver. Atlantic Provisions had not just stopped at destroying the waterfront storefront. They utilized a shadow subsidiary and their vast capital reserves to quietly purchase my father's distressed residential debt portfolio from the local Rhode Island bank at a premium. Preston now owned the mortgage on the Jung family home. The final paragraph of Sarah's message outlined the trap. Preston had filed an emergency foreclosure notice at the municipal courthouse. He planned to evict my parents by the end of the week. However, the legal notice included a unique settlement contingency. Preston offered to forgive the entire debt and return the house to my father, but only if I surrendered my new, independent logistics firm, signed a non-compete agreement with Atlantic Provisions, and handed over my exclusive contracts with the Ocean Drive estates. Preston was using my parents as financial hostages to force my surrender. He assumed the primal bond of family would compel me to sacrifice my new empire to save my father from homelessness. He thought he had found my breaking point. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the strict limits of my mercy. I stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone, the cold light illuminating the cramped cabin of the transit van. The heavy diesel engine rumbled beneath my boots, sending a steady, grounding vibration up through my legs. Preston had executed a hostile financial maneuver, assuming the traditional American family dynamic would serve as my fatal weakness. He believed the looming threat of my parents standing on the curb, their pristine belongings packed into cardboard boxes, would shatter my resolve. He pictured me weeping, eager to sign over my thriving logistics firm just to save the historic colonial mansion my grandfather had built. He fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of a woman who had spent 15 years being treated as a disposable asset. That house had never truly been my home. It was a museum dedicated to the Young family prestige. Every Thanksgiving, I sat at the edge of the sprawling mahogany dining table, listening to my father boast to his friends about his business acumen, while I quietly nursed the exhaustion of working a 14-hour shift at the docks to pay for the feast. Colin was the heir to the estate. I was just the unpaid estate manager. The thought of a bank foreclosing on those manicured lawns and echoing hallways did not evoke a single ounce of grief in my chest. It merely clarified the rules of engagement. Preston had escalated the conflict from corporate sabotage to overt blackmail. I shifted the van into gear and drove straight back to downtown Providence, navigating the slick, rain-swept streets with focused precision. I bypassed the receptionist at the Granite Tower and walked directly into Sarah's corner office. She was already pacing in front of her glass whiteboard, uncapping a dry erase marker, her expression sharp and clinical. "This is textbook extortion," Sarah stated, turning to face me as I closed the heavy oak door. "Atlantic Provisions utilized a shadow entity to buy the paper on your father's residential debt. They are accelerating the default clauses to force a crisis. Rhode Island allows non-judicial foreclosure if written into the mortgage terms, meaning they can auction the property in 45 days without ever stepping in front of a judge." I took a seat in the leather guest chair, crossing my legs. Preston wants my Ocean Drive contracts. He wants to absorb my independent supply chain before I starve his new flagship store of premium inventory. He sent the settlement offer through unofficial channels, Sarah noted, pointing her marker at a manila folder resting on her desk. "A private courier dropped that unsealed envelope at the front desk 10 minutes ago. It contains the non-compete forms and the asset transfer agreement. If you sign, they forgive your father's debt." "It is a shakedown," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It is," Sarah agreed, taking a seat across from me. "But proving it requires explicit linkage. Right now, on paper, a random debt buyer is simply foreclosing on a delinquent borrower. The settlement offer was delivered without a cover letter, without an email trail, and without corporate letterhead. Preston is shielding Atlantic Provisions from state antitrust inquiries. He is smart. He is arrogant," I corrected her, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the glass table. "Arrogance always leaves a paper trail. We just need to give him a reason to write it down." If Atlantic Provisions was caught using predatory residential debt acquisition to monopolize a local food supply chain, the Federal Trade Commission would open a sweeping inquiry. The bad press alone would tank their quarterly stock valuation. Preston was operating in the shadows because exposure would ruin his career. I needed him to tie the residential foreclosure directly to the commercial acquisition. I needed his signature on a document linking the two entities. Sarah raised a skeptical eyebrow. "He will never put that in a standard email, Charlene. He knows the legal exposure." "Then we make him feel like he has already won," I replied, staring at the blank settlement forms. Men like Preston cannot resist taking a victory lap. If he believes I am broken, he will want to dictate the terms to my face. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the contact number listed on the legal paperwork. It rang twice before the connection clicked open. Miss Young Preston answered, his tone smooth and deeply satisfied. I imagine you received my correspondence regarding your family's unfortunate financial predicament. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to shallow out, injecting a hollow, desperate note into my voice. You are going to put my parents on the street. I am simply managing a distressed asset portfolio, Preston countered, playing the corporate diplomat with practiced ease. However, I am always open to exploring mutual synergies. Have you considered my alternative proposal? I cannot lose the house, Preston, I whispered, gripping the phone tightly to sell the performance. My grandfather built that place. It is all we have left. A low, arrogant chuckle echoed through the receiver. I thought you might see reason. Business is harsh, Charlene, but it does not have to be a tragedy. Bring the signed asset transfer documents and the non-compete forms to the Capitol Grill at 8 o'clock tonight. We will share a steak, finalize the transition, and I will hand you the canceled mortgage note. I need a guarantee, I insisted, maintaining the facade of a cornered, terrified victim. I will not hand over my company unless you bring a drafted contract stating Atlantic Provisions is forgiving the residential debt in exchange for my commercial assets. I need both actions clearly outlined on one piece of paper. Preston paused. I held my breath, the silence stretching across the cellular network. If he refused, the trap failed. Fine, Preston agreed, his ego overriding his legal caution. I will bring a consolidated settlement agreement. You bring your client lists. Do not be late. He ended the call. I lowered the phone, the faint panic evaporating from my features, instantly replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Sarah smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression crossing her face. He is drafting his own federal indictment. We spent the next 2 hours prepping the sting. Sarah contacted a trusted colleague at the State Attorney General's office, arranging for an undercover investigator to sit 2 tables away at the restaurant, ready to witness the document exchange. I reviewed the financial statutes, ensuring I knew exactly which antitrust clauses to cite when the trap snapped shut. The plan was flawless, insulated by legal precedent and tactical precision. I left the law firm as the winter sun dipped below the Providence skyline. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long reflections on the wet pavement. I unlocked the transit van and climbed inside the leather seat cold against my back. Before I could insert the key into the ignition, my phone rang. The screen displayed Colin's name. I almost ignored it. My brother had caused enough damage for one lifetime. But the sheer persistence of the ringing indicated a new variable had entered the equation. I pressed the answer icon and lifted the device to my ear. Charlene Colin gasped, his voice tight with an erratic, breathless panic. Where are you? Have you signed the papers yet? I am handling the situation. Tonight, Colin, I said, my tone clipped and dismissive. Stay at the house. Do not speak to anyone. You do not understand, he interrupted, the pitch of his voice rising into raw hysteria. Dad found out about the foreclosure notice. He opened the mail while I was in the kitchen. He lost his mind, Char. He said he would rather die than let the country club see him evicted. I gripped the steering wheel, a dark sense of foreboding settling into my stomach. Where is he, Colin? He took the hunting rifle from the den. Colin sobbed, the sound of a revving engine echoing in the background of the call. He got into his car 10 minutes ago. He found Preston's hotel room number on the legal paperwork. He said he is going to solve the problem himself. My blood ran cold. The meticulous, sterile legal trap I had just spent hours building was about to be obliterated. My father, stripped of his dignity and his legacy, was driving toward a corporate buyer with a loaded firearm. He was no longer operating on logic. He was operating on the primal, destructive instinct of a ruined man with nothing left to lose. "Call the police, Colin," I ordered, shifting the van into drive. "I cannot," he wept. "If I call the cops, he goes to prison. You have to stop him, Charlene, please." The line went dead. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The heavy van surged forward into the dark city streets. I had less than 20 minutes to intercept my father before a corporate extortion case transformed into a homicide investigation. The heavy tires of the transit van gripped the wet asphalt as I pushed the diesel engine past its intended limits. The Providence streetlights blurred into streaks of yellow and white rain. The wipers fought a losing battle against the freezing sleet. My hands clamped the steering wheel with rigid force. The sterile, clinical legal trap I had engineered with Sarah was disintegrating in real time. A corporate extortion case required pristine optics, a clear divide between the ruthless conglomerate and the victimized local merchant. A domestic homicide would erase all of that. To grasp the surreal nature of the threat you have, to understand the hunting rifle my father took from the den. It was a vintage Winchester, featuring a polished walnut stock and custom silver engravings. He purchased the firearm at a charity auction a decade ago for an obscene amount of money. He never purchased ammunition. He never secured a hunting license. He mounted the weapon above the stone fireplace to project a curated image of rugged traditional masculinity to his golfing peers. The gun was a prop in the Grand Theater of David Young. The idea that he was now carrying that prop into a luxury downtown hotel to confront a corporate shark was horrifying. He was not a killer. He was an aging narcissist, watching his audience walk out of the theater, and he was reacting with pure, unfiltered panic. I pulled into the parking garage of the Providence Plaza Hotel, a towering glass and steel structure favored by visiting executives. My eyes scanned the dimly lit concrete rows, searching for his vehicle. Tires squealed as I took a sharp corner onto the third level. There it was. The silver luxury sedan sat parked at a crooked angle across two reserved spaces. The driver's side door remained unlatched. The engine ticked quietly, radiating heat into the damp garage air. I parked my van a few yards away and killed the ignition. I stepped out into the frigid air, leaving my keys in my pocket. I did not run toward the grand lobby. I knew the architecture of these downtown high-rises. I supplied their catering kitchens for years. I bypassed the glass double doors and headed straight for the discreet service entrance utilized by maintenance staff. The heavy steel fire door yielded to my pull. I stepped into a stark concrete stairwell, bathed in harsh fluorescent light. I checked the directory posted on the wall. The executive suites occupied the top 3 floors. I did not wait for the service elevator. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my boots echoing like rhythmic drumbeats in the hollow shaft. My lungs burned with the cold air, but I forced my breathing to remain measured and tactical. Panic breeds mistakes, and I could not afford a single miscalculation. I reached the 20th floor landing and cracked the heavy fire door open. The executive hallway stretched before me, lined with plush, geometric carpet and subdued, warm lighting. It smelled of expensive cedar air freshener and silent wealth. Halfway down the corridor, standing in front of Suite 2014, was my father. He wore his plush bathrobe over his dress trousers, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the hotel. He held a long green canvas sleeve in his right hand, the shape of the Winchester rifle pressed against the fabric. His shoulders hunched, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He raised his free hand and balled it into a fist, preparing to pound on Preston's door. "Dad," I said. My voice was not a shout. It was a quiet, sharp command that cut through the silence of the hallway like a scalpel. He froze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His face was a mask of gray exhaustion, slick with nervous sweat. He looked at me blinking, as if trying to clear a dense fog from his vision. "Charlene," he gasped, his voice thin and hollow. "Go home. You do not need to see this. I am fixing the problem. I am saving our house." I let the heavy fire door click shut behind me. I walked slowly down the center of the corridor, closing the distance between us. I kept my hands visible, my posture relaxed, projecting an aura of total control. "You are not fixing anything, Dad," I stated, maintaining steady eye contact. "You are holding an antique rifle in a hotel hallway. There are security cameras pointing at us from both ends of this ceiling. If you knock on that door, Preston will not cower. He will call the police. The state troopers will arrive in 3 minutes. They will not ask questions. They will put you on the ground in handcuffs." He gripped the canvas sleeve tighter, his knuckles turning a stark shade of white. "He stole our legacy, Charlene. He humiliated me. He is going to take the house and turn us into a public spectacle. I cannot let the country club see me evicted. I would rather die." I stopped 5 feet away from him. The scent of stale scotch and fear radiated from his clothes. He was trapped in a cage built from his own vanity, terrified of the judgment of wealthy strangers. "If you point that weapon at a corporate buyer, you do not get the house back," I explained, my tone dropping into a register of pure, freezing logic. "The bank still forecloses. The country club still reads about your bankruptcy. But instead of moving into a smaller home, you move into a concrete cell at the state penitentiary. Colin will have to visit you behind reinforced glass. Mother will spend the rest of her life answering questions from reporters about her deranged husband. Is that the final legacy you want to leave your favorite son?" The words struck him with physical force. His posture crumbled. The grand, imposing patriarch vanished entirely, leaving behind a frail, terrified man. He looked down at the canvas bag in his hand, as if he suddenly realized what it contained. The illusion of righteous vengeance evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. "I cannot lose everything," he whispered, a single tear escaping his bloodshot eye and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "You already lost the store," I said softly, reaching out and placing my hand firmly over his fingers, gripping the canvas sleeve. "But you do not have to lose your freedom tonight. Let go." For a long, agonizing moment, he resisted, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door of the suite. Then the tension drained from his arms. He released his grip, the canvas bag slid into my hands. The weapon was heavy, cold, and entirely useless. I took a step back, securing the rifle by my side. "Go back to the car, Dad. Drive home. I am handling Atlantic Provisions my way." My father nodded weakly, his chin trembling. He turned away, a broken man, shuffling down the plush carpet toward the main elevators. He had spent my entire life dictating my future, and now he was walking away in silence, trusting me to extinguish the fire he had ignited. I exhaled a slow, shaky breath. The immediate crisis was averted. The homicide investigation was neutralized. I just needed to take the stairs back down to the transit van, secure the firearm, and drive to the Capitol Grill to execute the legal sting with Sarah. Before I could turn around, the sharp electronic chime of the nearby elevator pierced the quiet hallway. The brushed steel doors slid open. Preston stepped out into the corridor. He wore a pristine, tailored suit, holding his Italian leather briefcase in one hand and a sleek smartphone in the other. He was heading to the lobby, preparing to meet me for the extortion dinner we had arranged. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locked onto me standing in front of his suite. His gaze traveled down my arm, landing squarely on the long, unmistakable shape of the hunting rifle concealed within the green canvas sleeve. He looked down the hall and caught a brief glimpse of my father stepping into a different elevator car. Preston was a corporate predator. He processed information with terrifying speed. He calculated the variables, connected the dots, and realized exactly what had just transpired outside his door. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "Well, this is an unexpected deviation from our itinerary," Ms. Jung Preston said, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "It appears your father came here to renegotiate our terms with a firearm." I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. "My father is experiencing a medical episode. I am taking his antique heirloom back to secure storage. There is no threat here, Preston." Preston stopped 3 feet away, his smile widening into a sinister grin. He looked at the security camera mounted above our heads. "I disagree, Charlene," he countered smoothly. "I see a disgruntled, bankrupt man fleeing the scene. I see his daughter holding a lethal weapon outside my hotel room. If I dial emergency services right now and show them the security footage, the local prosecutor will file attempted armed robbery charges against your father before midnight. Given his recent bank fraud issues, he will not receive bail." The air in the hallway grew suffocating. The meticulous legal trap I had set at the restaurant was useless. Preston had just captured a real-time hostage. Preston unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out the consolidated settlement agreement. He clicked a silver pen and held it out toward me. "We are skipping dinner," Preston announced, his voice echoing with triumphant authority. "You are going to sign this asset transfer and the non-compete agreement right here, right now, using this wall as a desk. You will surrender your logistics firm, and I will delete the security footage of your father attempting to murder me. Decline, and I make the phone call. The choice is yours." My father, standing in the plush hallway of the luxury hotel with a vintage Winchester rifle, was a catastrophe waiting to ignite. He believed he had engineered the perfect solution to his wounded pride, failing to realize that pointing an antique firearm at a corporate predator like Preston would only guarantee a decade in a federal penitentiary. I had managed to disarm him, utilizing pure, freezing logic to shatter his delusion, sending him walking back to the elevators as a broken, terrified man. But the immediate crisis was replaced by a far more dangerous threat, the moment the polished steel doors slid open and Preston stepped out of his executive suite. Preston was a corporate climber who thrived in sanitized boardrooms, a man who isolated vulnerable local competitors and squeezed their supply chains until they suffocated. He processed the scene in the corridor, my father fleeing, the long canvas bag in my hand with terrifying speed. He recognized the leverage instantly. He unlatched his Italian leather briefcase, pulled out the consolidated settlement agreement, and offered me a silver pen. He demanded I sign over my independent logistics firm and agree to a draconian non-compete clause right there against the hallway wall, explicitly threatening to call the state troopers and share the hotel security footage of my armed father if I refused. "Sign the contract," Charlene Preston urged, his voice a smooth, venomous whisper. "You save your father from prison, and I save myself a trip to our scheduled dinner." I kept my expression entirely neutral, rapidly calculating the legal geometry of the corridor. Rhode Island is a one-party consent state regarding audio surveillance. I did not need his permission to capture his extortion. I shifted my weight slightly, sliding my left hand into the deep pocket of my waterproof jacket. My thumb found the side button of my smartphone, pressing it twice to activate the hidden voice memo application. "You are demanding I surrender a highly profitable commercial enterprise under the direct threat of a criminal prosecution," I stated, ensuring my voice was loud enough to register clearly through the fabric of my coat. "You are explicitly stating that if I do not sign over my proprietary client lists to Atlantic Provisions right now, you will contact law enforcement to arrest David Young for attempted armed robbery." Preston chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound that echoed faintly down the empty hallway. "Do not attempt to play lawyer with me, Ms. Jung. I am merely offering a civil settlement to a very complex dispute. Your father arrived at my door with a lethal weapon. I am choosing to handle the transgression internally, provided we reach a mutual business understanding. The police do not need to be burdened with our negotiations." He had just verbally confirmed the quid pro quo. The digital recording was secure. However, a crucial tactical problem remained. A recorded confession of extortion might invalidate the contract in a civil courtroom 3 months from now, but it would not stop Preston from dialing 911 tonight. If I refused to sign, he would immediately call the state troopers. My father would be intercepted before he even reached the city limits, dragged out of his luxury sedan at gunpoint, and charged with a violent felony. I despised the man my father had become, but I would not allow a corporate parasite to use my family as collateral damage to secure a grocery monopoly. I removed my hand from my pocket and reached for the silver pen. "You operate under the assumption that a signature on a piece of paper grants you ownership of the ocean, Preston," I said, clicking the pen and pressing the tip against the thick parchment. I signed my name in a smooth, fluid motion on the bottom line of the asset transfer agreement. I flipped to the second page and signed the non-compete clause. Preston watched the ink dry, a look of profound, greedy satisfaction washing over his polished features. He pulled the documents back, snapping his briefcase shut. "A wise decision," he remarked, adjusting his silk tie. "I will file the mortgage forgiveness paperwork tomorrow morning. You have 24 hours to transfer the digital logistics portals to my IT department. Any attempt to solicit the Ocean Drive estates will constitute a breach of this settlement, and I will unleash an army of corporate litigators to ruin whatever is left of your life. Have a pleasant evening, Charlene." He turned on his heel and walked back into his executive suite, sealing himself within his temporary luxury fortress. I stood alone in the hallway, the heavy canvas bag resting quietly by my side. On paper, I was entirely defeated. I walked toward the stairwell, descended the 20 flights of concrete stairs, stepped out into the freezing parking garage, and locked the firearm inside the secure storage compartment of the transit van. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the diesel engine, and pulled out my phone. I stopped the audio recording immediately, uploaded the encrypted file to Sarah at the law firm, and dialed her direct line. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Are you at the restaurant?" Preston intercepted me at the hotel. I reported my voice, a flat, mechanical drone. My father showed up at his suite with a hunting rifle. I disarmed him, but Preston caught us in the hallway. He leveraged the threat of a police response to force my signature on the settlement agreement. The sting at the restaurant is dead. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the receiver. "Charlene, if you sign that non-compete under duress, you are legally paralyzed. Atlantic Provisions can freeze your operating accounts by dawn." They can freeze the accounts, I agreed, steering the van out of the garage and merging into the downtown traffic. But they cannot freeze the harbor. Preston thinks he bought a functioning supply chain. He fails to realize that my network operates on a currency he does not possess. I am going to let him try to collect his prize tomorrow. We will file the extortion recording with the Attorney General after the fallout. I ended the call and drove through the dark, rain-swept streets of Providence. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical weight. I had spent the last 48 hours fighting a multi-front war against my own bloodline and a billion-dollar conglomerate. I parked the van outside my apartment building, climbed the stairs to my unit, and collapsed into bed, letting the rhythmic sound of the rain against the window pull me into a deep, dreamless sleep. The shrill, piercing ring of my cell phone shattered the silence at 4:30 in the morning. I fumbled for the phone on the nightstand, squinting against the harsh glare of the screen. The caller ID displayed Nathaniel, the chief estate manager from the Ocean Drive compound. "Good morning, Nathaniel," I answered, my voice raspy with sleep. "Charlene," Nathaniel said, his tone devoid of its usual measured professionalism. "I am standing at the service gate with Chef Henri. There is a massive commercial box truck blocking the delivery entrance. The side of the truck features a brightly painted Atlantic Provisions logo. The driver is refusing to move, claiming he holds an exclusive corporate contract to provision this estate. He is also demanding an upfront security deposit to unload the daily scallops. Preston had not wasted a single minute. Armed with the signed contract, he had dispatched his corporate fleet to seize my premium clients, attempting to force his standardized logistics onto a bespoke luxury ecosystem. He assumed the estate managers would blindly comply with a legal document they had never seen. "Do not give him a single cent," Nathaniel I instructed, swinging my legs out of bed and planting my feet on the cold hardwood floor. "I have no intention of paying a corporate delivery driver a security deposit," Nathaniel snapped. "If this truck is not removed from my service gate in 10 minutes, I am authorizing my private security detail to drag the vehicle onto the main highway." "Where is your transit van?" Charlene. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed my keys from the counter. "I am legally barred from delivering the inventory today, Nathaniel. Atlantic Provisions extorted my signature on a non-compete agreement last night. They technically own the supply route." Nathaniel fell completely silent. The implications of my statement rippled through the cell connection. He managed $100 million estate. He despised corporate bullying, especially when it interfered with the smooth operation of his compound. "They extorted you?" Nathaniel asked, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register. "They threatened to have my father imprisoned if I did not sign over the company," I confirmed. "Preston sent that box truck assuming you would bow to his corporate paperwork." Nathaniel let out a sharp, cold laugh. "Tell me, Charlene, does Atlantic Provisions possess a signed vendor contract with the owner of this estate?" "No," I replied. "They only possess a contract stating I cannot compete against them." "Then they are trespassing on private property," Nathaniel declared. "I am going to have the driver detained for unauthorized commercial solicitation, and then I am going to make a phone call to a very specific contact at the Federal Trade Commission who happens to spend his summers in our guest house." Before I could process the magnitude of Nathaniel bringing a federal regulator into the battle, an aggressive, frantic pounding echoed through my apartment. Someone was hammering their fists against my front door. I lowered the phone, my pulse racing. "Nathaniel, I need to call you back." I ended the call and walked slowly toward the entryway. The pounding continued, accompanied by a muffled, hysterical voice crying out from the hallway. I looked through the brass peephole. My mother stood on the doormat. Her clothes were soaked from the freezing rain, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She was shivering violently, clutching a small leather travel bag to her chest. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Charlene," my mother gasped, pushing past me into the warm apartment without waiting for an invitation. She dropped the travel bag onto the floor, her entire body trembling with a mixture of cold and pure, unadulterated terror. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, closing and locking the door behind her. "They took the house," she sobbed, collapsing onto the living room sofa. "The federal marshals came an hour ago. They did not care about the foreclosure notice from Preston. They executed a seizure warrant related to the bank fraud Colin committed. They arrested your father. They arrested your brother. They told me to pack one bag and leave the premises. You are the only person I have left." The sight of my mother sitting on my living room sofa clutching a damp leather travel bag to her chest brought a strange, hollow silence to the apartment. She trembled, her designer coat dripping freezing rain onto the hardwood floor. For my entire existence, she had operated as the pristine architect of our family facade. She orchestrated the holiday parties, selected the country club attire, and meticulously swept every uncomfortable truth under the Persian rugs. She insulated my father from the consequences of his financial reckless behavior and shielded Colin from the reality of his own failures. Now sitting in the gray light of dawn, the architect watched her flawless house of cards collapse under the weight of a federal raid. "Charlene, you have to call your attorney." my mother pleaded, her voice cracking as tears mingled with the rain on her cheeks. Tell them to contact the authorities. Explain that Colin did not understand the bank documents. Tell them your father was under immense stress regarding the storefront. We can fix this if we just present a unified front. I walked into the kitchen, pulled a clean towel from the drawer, and handed it to her. I did not sit beside her. I remained standing, a deliberate physical barrier between my new reality and her enduring delusions. There is no unified front, Mother, I stated, keeping my tone level and detached. Colin and Dad forged signatures on commercial loan applications to cover a fraudulent caviar invoice. They triggered an interstate banking investigation. The federal marshals do not care about retail stress. They care about felony wire fraud. I cannot call a lawyer to erase a crime they committed on high-definition bank security cameras. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The maternal authority she had wielded for 3 decades evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, terrified woman who had never learned how to function outside the protective bubble of stolen wealth. "You are just going to let them go to prison?" she whispered, her hands gripping the towel. "I did not put them in handcuffs," I replied quietly. I offered Colin a stable transition, and he stole my identity. I offered Dad a thriving logistics hub, and he leased it to a corporate predator. They built their own prison. I am just refusing to lock myself inside the cell with them. Before she could launch another desperate plea, my mind connected a sudden, brilliant tactical thread. The federal raid on my family home had occurred at 4 a.m. Preston, operating under the assumption that he held all the leverage, had promised to file the residential mortgage forgiveness paperwork at the municipal courthouse the moment the clerk offices opened. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Sarah. She answered immediately, the sound of typing echoing in the background. "Sarah, I need a rapid legal assessment," I said, pacing across the kitchen tile. If Atlantic Provisions utilized a shadow subsidiary to purchase my father's distressed residential debt portfolio, they legally assume the liability of that specific financial instrument, correct? "Yes," Sarah confirmed, her voice sharp and alert. "They hold the note. They own the leverage. But the federal marshals just raided that exact property I explained the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with beautiful, devastating precision. They seized the house and arrested my father for attempting to execute a fraudulent bridge loan tied directly to that specific estate. If Preston files the settlement paperwork this morning, officially linking Atlantic Provisions to that toxic asset in exchange for my commercial logistics firm, what happens to his corporate insulation? The typing on Sarah's end of the line stopped abruptly. A low, breathless chuckle radiated through the receiver. Charlene Sarah said, the thrill of the legal kill coloring her words. If Preston files that settlement agreement he is submitting, documented proof to the federal government that Atlantic Provisions acquired an active crime scene to extort a local business owner. The moment that paper hits the municipal ledger, the United States Attorney will subpoena Preston for obstructing a federal banking investigation and trading in illicit financial instruments. He is stepping onto a legal landmine. "Do not file our audio recording," yet I instructed, a cold smile touching my lips. "Let him file his paperwork first. Let him lock himself into the federal grid. I will monitor the municipal database," Sarah promised. "I will call you the second his signature registers." I ended the call and turned my attention back to the immediate logistical war. Nathaniel had already blocked the Atlantic Provisions delivery truck at the Ocean Drive compound. Now I needed to check the temperature at the harbor. I dialed Elias. The call connected against a backdrop of howling coastal wind and the heavy rumble of idling diesel engines. "Talk to me, Elias," I requested. "It is a circus down here, Char," Elias rumbled, sounding deeply amused. "Atlantic Provisions sent 3 massive refrigerated box trucks to Point Judith at 5 a.m. They parked right in front of the main loading bays, flashing their headlights, expecting us to fill their cargo holds with the morning catch." "How did the dockhands respond?" I asked. Thomas brought his tractors down from the farm cooperative and parked them directly behind the corporate trucks. Elias chuckled. Marcus parked his bakery delivery vans in front of them. The corporate fleet is currently boxed in tight. The drivers are sitting in their cabs honking their horns while every independent fisherman on this pier walks right past them to load the secondary transport vehicles. They brought $50,000 contracts, Char. They forgot to bring respect. Hold the line, Elias, I said, pride swelling in my chest. I will route my transit van to the secondary docks in an hour. I set the phone on the granite counter and looked at my mother. She was staring at the floor, the towel forgotten in her lap, realizing the world she knew had vanished forever. The harbor belonged to the artisans. The estates belonged to the independent operators. The federal government owned the family mansion. The digital clock on the microwave shifted to 8:15. My phone vibrated, sliding an inch across the smooth stone counter. The caller ID displayed an unknown corporate number. I tapped the speaker icon. Miss Young, Preston barked his voice, stripped of its polished veneer, vibrating with raw, unfiltered panic. What sort of games are you playing this morning? I poured myself a glass of cold water, taking a slow sip. I am standing in my kitchen, Preston. I am not playing anything. My fleet is stranded at Point Judith, Preston snarled. The local suppliers are refusing to honor the exclusivity contracts. My drivers are trapped behind farm equipment. Furthermore, the chief estate manager at Ocean Drive just had my premier delivery vehicle impounded by the local authorities for trespassing, and he threatened to unleash a contact at the Federal Trade Commission on my board of directors. It sounds like you are experiencing supply chain friction, I noted, keeping my tone perfectly mild. You should review your operational protocols. You signed a non-compete agreement last night, Preston shouted, the sound of a fist slamming against a desk echoing through the line. You surrendered your logistics firm. You are legally required to facilitate this transition. Call your vendors and instruct them to load my trucks immediately, or I will release the hotel security footage to the state troopers and send your father to prison. I took another sip of water, feeling the icy liquid cool my throat. You are a bit late on the threat timeline, Preston, I replied, letting the cold reality of his situation bleed into my words. The federal marshals raided my family home 4 hours ago. My father and my brother are currently sitting in a holding cell, facing federal bank fraud charges. The security footage of an old man holding a hunting rifle is the least of their concerns today. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the cellular connection. I could practically hear the tactical gears grinding to a halt inside Preston's head. The residential debt you purchased through your shadow subsidiary, I continued twisting the knife with surgical precision. It is tied to a fraudulent loan application. The estate you hold the mortgage on is an active federal crime scene. Tell me, Preston, did you file the settlement paperwork at the courthouse this morning? Did you submit the document proving you traded debt on a federal crime scene to secure a grocery monopoly? Preston did not answer. The sound of his ragged, shallow breathing filled the quiet kitchen. He realized the trap had snapped shut, severing his career, his leverage, and his freedom in a single devastating stroke. The line remained dead silent. I could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the cellular connection and the shallow, erratic draw of breath from the man who had assumed he owned the entire eastern seaboard. Preston had built his career on exploiting the vulnerable, leveraging corporate capital to crush independent artisans. He had never encountered a target who understood how to turn the weight of the federal government against him. "Are you still there, Preston?" I asked, my voice carrying the calm, rhythmic cadence of the ocean tide. "You set me up!" he choked out, the polished arrogance replaced by raw, suffocating terror. "I did not file the paperwork, Preston," I reminded him. "You marched into the municipal courthouse this morning and filed a legal document tethering your multi-billion-dollar conglomerate to an active federal financial crime. You traded illicit debt to extort a local logistics firm. I simply stepped out of your way and let your own greed carry you off the cliff. I suggest you retain a very expensive criminal defense attorney. Have a pleasant morning." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the cool granite counter. My mother watched me from the living room sofa. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking frail and remarkably ordinary. The designer coat she wore seemed heavy, a relic of a life that no longer existed. For decades, she had curated the illusion of our family's superiority, treating my labor as a convenient resource to fund Colin and his endless string of failures. Now, sitting in my modest apartment, the illusion was shattered into irreparable shards. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "I secured my future," I answered, walking over to the coat rack near the front door. I pulled my waterproof jacket from the hook and slipped it over my shoulders. "And I ensured the man who demolished your husband's historic storefront will spend the next decade answering questions in a federal courtroom." "Where am I supposed to go?" she pleaded, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle of her leather travel bag. "I have no money. The marshals froze the checking accounts. Your father is in a holding cell. You cannot just leave me here." I pulled a sleek silver money clip from my pocket, extracted a stack of $50 bills, and set the cash on the small table near the entryway. "There is a modest motel 2 miles down the highway," I told her. My tone devoid of anger, radiating only a cold, clinical detachment. "That cash will cover a room for a week and buy your meals. You are going to walk out of this door, call a taxi, and start figuring out how to live in the real world. You spent 30 years enabling the men who tried to ruin me. I am not offering you a spare bedroom. I am offering you the door." She stared at the cash, her chin trembling. She wanted to argue. She wanted to summon the old maternal authority to guilt me into submission. But she looked at my eyes and recognized the harsh, undeniable truth. The daughter she had marginalized was gone. The woman standing before her was forged in iron and salt water. She stood up slowly, her shoulders slumping. She picked up her bag, retrieved the cash with shaking fingers, and walked out into the rain-swept hallway without saying a single word. I locked the deadbolt behind her, sealing the quiet sanctuary of my home. The fallout over the next 6 months was spectacular, a sweeping sequence of poetic justice that rearranged the Rhode Island coastline. Sarah delivered the audio recording of Preston issuing his extortion demands to the United States Attorney the same afternoon he filed the settlement paperwork. The federal prosecutor moved with terrifying speed. Preston was subpoenaed before the week ended. Facing an agonizing federal indictment for obstructing an active banking investigation and utilizing illicit debt instruments Preston attempted to leverage his corporate backing. Atlantic Provisions, however, operated on ruthless pragmatism. The moment the Federal Trade Commission announced a sweeping antitrust probe into their predatory expansion tactics, the board of directors severed all ties with Preston. They fired him, revoked his stock options, and issued a public statement condemning his rogue behavior. Preston signed a plea agreement to avoid a prolonged trial, accepting a substantial sentence in a minimum security federal camp. His career as a corporate shark ended in a drab courtroom stripped of his tailored suits and his unearned authority. Atlantic Provisions, desperate to appease the federal regulators and halt the plunging trajectory of their quarterly stock valuation, abandoned their Rhode Island expansion. They halted construction on the flagship supermarket and placed the empty waterfront lot where my family storefront once stood, up for immediate commercial auction. The fate of my father and brother followed a similarly devastating trajectory. The bank security footage was undeniable. The forged signatures on the bridge loan tied them directly to felony wire fraud. My father, terrified of the prospect of a public trial exposing his vast hidden debts to his country club peers, accepted a harsh plea deal. He surrendered the ancestral colonial mansion, his luxury vehicles, and the remnants of his retirement accounts to pay restitution. He avoided federal prison due to his advanced age and failing health, but the judge sentenced him to 5 years of supervised probation. He currently rents a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of Warwick, living on a fixed income entirely erased from the elite social circles he once ruled. Colin did not fare as well. The judge looked at his history of reckless entitlement, the forged caviar invoice, and his central role in the banking fraud, and handed down a sentence that shattered his fragile ego. Colin served 8 months in a state correctional facility. Upon his release, burdened with a towering mountain of court-ordered restitution, he was forced to secure immediate, verifiable employment. The boy who had sneered at dockhands and demanded retainers from billionaire chefs now works the graveyard shift at a commercial tire recycling plant. He unloads heavy rubber treads in the freezing rain, performing the exact type of grueling blue-collar labor he spent his entire life mocking. As for my independent logistics firm, the initial storm catalyzed a period of unprecedented growth. The unified front displayed by the local artisans at Point Judith sent a powerful message across the eastern seaboard. I honored every handshake, paid every invoice upon delivery, and maintained the strict quality standards the elite market demanded. Nathaniel expanded our contract to cover 3 additional luxury compounds on Ocean Drive. Chef Henri introduced my procurement services to a network of Michelin-rated restaurants in Boston. Dominic built 2 more custom thermal transit vans to handle the surging volume, and Elias upgraded his primary fishing vessel using a zero-interest loan I provided from my operating surplus. The ultimate victory, however, arrived on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in early spring. I stood on the cobblestone sidewalk near the harbor, the salt breeze carrying the scent of blooming seagrass. The tall chain-link fencing still surrounded the empty dirt lot where my family storefront had stood. I held a thick manila folder in my hands. Sarah stood beside me, wearing a sharp charcoal trench coat, holding a cup of steaming dark roast coffee. "The wire transfer cleared an hour ago," Sarah announced, a proud smile spreading across her face. "The deed is officially recorded. You own the parcel outright, Charlene, free and clear." When Atlantic Provisions auctioned the distressed waterfront lot, they sought a rapid liquidation to appease their anxious shareholders. Utilizing the substantial capital reserves generated by my booming logistics firm, I purchased the prime real estate for a fraction of its original market value. "I am not building a retail storefront," I told Sarah, looking out over the empty dirt toward the shimmering blue waters of the bay. "The era of waiting behind a cash register is over." I opened the manila folder and pulled out a set of architectural blueprints. They detailed a state-of-the-art climate-controlled distribution warehouse. The facility featured dedicated loading bays for the local fishermen, vast thermal storage for the organic farm cooperatives, and a sleek administrative suite overlooking the marina. It was designed to function as the permanent, untouchable stronghold for the independent artisans of Rhode Island. I walked forward and pressed my hand against the cold metal of the chain-link fence. The legacy my father had weaponized and squandered was gone. In its place, I was constructing a fortress built on mutual respect, transparent equity, and unbreakable trust. I took a deep breath of the coastal air, feeling the sun warm my face. The weight of my past had finally fractured and dissolved into the ocean. I was 34 years old, standing on ground I owned, holding the blueprints to an empire they told me I was unfit to build. If you ever find yourself standing in the shadows of entitled people who demand your labor while diminishing your worth, let this story serve as your blueprint. True power does not require a tailored suit, a country club membership, or a loud voice. True power is built in the quiet, freezing hours before dawn. It is the steady compilation of leverage, the unyielding adherence to your own standards, and the courage to walk out of the door with nothing but your phone in your pocket. Thank you for spending your time with Intimately Told Stories. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you walked away from a toxic environment and built your own table. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never hand the keys to your life to someone who does not know how to steer the ship. In the tapestry of American culture, we are frequently sold a highly sanitized, glossy version of the traditional family. We worship the archetype of generational wealth, the passing of the torch from one generation to the next, building a fortress of security designed to withstand the unpredictable forces of the world. Yet as we trace the turbulent, devastating arc of Charlene's story, this myth is systematically dismantled. The narrative exposes the insidious rot that can fester beneath polished mahogany veneers and exclusive country club memberships. It forces us to confront a terrifying, deeply uncomfortable question. What happens when the very people entrusted to protect and guide you decide that your intrinsic worth is merely a stepping stone to subsidize someone else's unearned privilege? The answer is a catastrophic unraveling of the family unit, driven by a profound failure in parenting. The true tragedy of the Young family was not the physical demolition of a historic waterfront property, nor was it the legal collapse of a commercial empire. The catastrophe was a profound systemic failure of fundamental parenting values. Charlene's parents operated under a distorted, toxic set of metrics, chronically confusing optics with character, and financial control with love. They raised their son Colin in a sterile vacuum entirely devoid of consequences. Every time he stumbled, failing out of universities, crashing expensive vehicles, they utilized their wealth to quietly erase his mistakes. In their desperate, antiquated attempt to mold a traditional male heir to carry the family legacy, they effectively crippled him. They mistook shielding a child from reality for loving him. Honest parenting requires the agonizing emotional awareness to let a child fail, to let them feel the scrape of the pavement so they can learn the mechanics of standing back up. Fairness dictates that competence, loyalty, and hard work are rewarded, not inherited as a birthright, regardless of merit. Instead, they handed Colin an empire he did not understand and could not manage, stripping it from the daughter whose sweat and quiet sacrifice had mortared its very foundation. This dynamic highlights a severe lack of emotional awareness that plagues many traditional family structures, the creation of the golden child and the scapegoat. Charlene was punished for her competence, her reliability weaponized against her to subsidize her brother's incompetence. A family operating on true emotional intelligence recognizes the distinct individual humanity of each child. Long-term guidance requires parents to foster resilience, not reliance. By constantly bailing Colin out and demanding Charlene's silent submission, her parents taught neither child how to navigate a world built on authentic trust. Colin learned that he was above the law, an arrogance that inevitably led him to federal bank fraud. Charlene learned that her blood relatives were her most dangerous adversaries. The very structure that was supposed to provide a haven of unconditional support became a sophisticated extortion racket. It proved that when honesty and fairness are abandoned to preserve a public facade, the family ceases to be a home and becomes a battleground. We are universally instructed by society, religion, and culture that family is everything. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires us to absorb the impact of our relatives' destructive choices. But here is a viewpoint that goes against every conventional greeting card and holiday movie. Family is not an absolute mandate. The title of parent or sibling does not grant someone infinite grace to exploit, diminish, or financially destroy you. Sometimes the most profound act of family responsibility you can perform is to stop saving them. Charlene's ultimate victory was not merely building a new massive commercial warehouse on the ashes of her father's failure. Her true triumph was the chilling, necessary act of closing her apartment door on her mother and letting the federal consequences run their natural course. She refused to act as the shock absorber for their crimes. To survive and thrive, she had to view her own flesh and blood as a toxic liability, choosing the health of her own soul over the survival of her abusers. Stories like this are not isolated incidents spun from fiction. They are reflections of the silent, agonizing battles fought in living rooms, kitchens, and boardrooms across the country every single day. They remind us that setting boundaries is rarely peaceful, and that walking away is often an act of tremendous bleeding courage. If this narrative struck a chord within your own life, if you have ever had to build a fortress out of the ruins of someone else's betrayal, we invite you to subscribe and follow Intimately Told Stories. Share your experiences in the comments below. We share these journeys because there is immense, unspoken power in realizing you are not the only one who had to sever a toxic root to finally allow yourself to grow. As we look at the metaphorical rubble of the Young family storefront, we are forced to stare into the mirror of our own homes and our own legacies. What are we truly passing down to the next generation? Is it genuine resilience, emotional intelligence, and the capacity for radical honesty? Or is it a fragile ego wrapped in a brittle, easily shattered inheritance? When we strip away the titles, the real estate, the wealth, and the societal expectations, what is actually left of the people we call our own? Perhaps the deepest, most pervasive tragedy of the American dream is the arrogant assumption that we can purchase our children's character. But character cannot be inherited, integrity cannot be forged on a bank document, and loyalty cannot be extorted through guilt. In the end, the ultimate measure of a family is not the towering empire they manage to build together, but whether that empire can survive the absolute, unvarnished truth. You cannot heal a tree that is rotten at its core by painting its leaves green. Sometimes the only true path to salvation is to strike the match, let the house burn to the ground, and learn to walk freely through the ashes.